Start cooking at 5 in the morning, my father ordered, tossing a massive list of demands in my face. Make everything perfect for 25 guests. I just nodded politely. But at 2 in the morning, I was stepping onto a first-class flight to the Caribbean. The next day, 24 starving relatives walked into an empty kitchen with a frozen turkey sitting on the counter, and the final message I sent them made my family lose everything they thought they owned. My name is Caroline. I am 35 years old, and for the longest time, I was the invisible bank account funding my family's delusions of grandeur. Before I get into exactly how I dismantled their perfect Thanksgiving, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the family doormat, just because you are the responsible one. You are going to love what I did next. It was exactly 5 o'clock on the Wednesday evening before Thanksgiving. The sky outside the kitchen window of our suburban Chicago home had already turned a bruised, freezing purple, signaling the start of a bitter winter night. I was sitting at the massive granite kitchen island, exhausted down to my very bones. As a director of supply chain logistics for a major retail distributor, the holiday season is nothing short of a waking nightmare. I had just wrapped up a punishing 60-hour workweek, frantically coordinating emergency freight shipments across the country, and my eyes were burning from staring at spreadsheets for days on end. All I wanted was a hot shower, a simple meal, and a decent night of sleep. This year was supposed to be easy. For weeks, the family consensus was that we were doing a casual catered potluck for the holidays. I had already spent my own money to pre-order high-end bakery pies, artisanal side dishes, and a massive honey-baked ham from a premium local butcher. Everything was handled. I was just typing out my final out-of-office email, ready to shut my company laptop for a desperately needed 4-day weekend when the heavy, sharp slap of thick plastic hit my keyboard. I flinched, pulling my hands back just in time to avoid getting my fingers pinched. I looked down in confusion. Sitting directly on top of my open laptop was a 3-page color-coded, professionally laminated grocery and preparation list. I stared at the glossy surface, my tired brain trying to process what I was looking at. There were perfectly typed columns for handmade hors d'oeuvres, specific imported wine pairings, and a detailed hourly schedule starting before dawn. I looked up to see my father Thomas adjusting the cuffs of his expensive cashmere golf sweater. He did not even bother to look me in the eye. Start cooking at 5 in the morning, he ordered, his tone flat and entirely expectant, like a restaurant manager addressing a newly hired prep cook. 25 people are coming tomorrow. Your mother invited the entire country club executive board. Make sure everything is absolutely perfect. I sat there staring at him as the cursor blinked uselessly under the laminated edge of his ridiculous, impossible list. Dad, what are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and reasonable. We all agreed on a potluck this year. I already picked up the ham and the desserts. I worked 60 hours this week. I am physically exhausted. Thomas finally looked at me, his expression immediately tightening with intense annoyance. He crossed his arms over his chest, a defensive gesture he always used when he wanted to assert absolute dominance in a room. Change of plans, he said dismissively, waving a hand in the air. A potluck is incredibly tacky. We are hosting the board members. We need a traditional formal sit-down dinner to impress them. I expect the good silver polished by tonight, and you need to go to the specialty market before they close to get the fresh ingredients. And do not argue with me, Caroline. Just get it done. Before I could even begin to point out the absolute physical impossibility of sourcing and cooking a gourmet feast for 25 people with 12 hours of notice, the sharp rhythmic click of designer heels echoed on the hardwood floor of the hallway. My mother Susan swept into the kitchen. She smelled strongly of her signature expensive jasmine perfume, a cloying scent that always seemed to precede her endless demands. She was already dressed for an evening cocktail party, carefully adjusting a heavy pearl necklace at her throat. She caught the end of our conversation and let out a dramatic, long-suffering sigh. She rolled her eyes toward the ceiling as if I were a spoiled toddler throwing a senseless tantrum over eating vegetables. "Oh, please stop being so dramatic, Caroline," my mother snapped. She leaned against the marble counter, looking at me with undisguised pity and irritation. You are making a huge deal out of absolutely nothing. You are single, you have no children to look after, and you live here under our roof. Helping your family host a simple dinner is literally the absolute least you can do. Under our roof. The words hung in the warm air of the kitchen so incredibly heavy and deeply absurd that I actually felt a bitter, sharp laugh rise in the back of my throat. I pressed my lips tightly together and gripped the warm ceramic of my coffee mug, squeezing it until my knuckles turned white, just to keep my hands from shaking. Under our roof. They loved saying that phrase. They wielded those three words like a loaded weapon every single time they needed to force me into submission or make me feel small. What they conveniently ignored, what they forcefully blocked out of their daily reality, was the actual legal truth about this beautiful, sprawling, four-bedroom suburban house. 3 years ago, my parents were on the brink of absolute financial ruin. Thomas, in his infinite wisdom, had taken out a massive predatory second mortgage on this exact house to fund one of my brother-in-law's ridiculous, doomed from the start, luxury business ventures. When the business inevitably failed and the money vanished into thin air, the bank aggressively moved in. My parents were exactly 30 days away from being dragged out onto the street with nothing but their clothes. In absolute desperation, stripped of their pride, they came crying to me. I was always the responsible one, the boring one, the quiet daughter who lived frugally, worked tirelessly, and saved aggressively while they bought expensive country club memberships they could never actually afford. So I stepped in. I bought the house directly from the bank during the foreclosure process. I used a private limited liability company to make the purchase, so their precious country club neighbors would never find out the embarrassing truth. I saved them from total social humiliation and homelessness. I am the sole legal owner of this property. I pay the crushing property taxes. I pay the expensive homeowner's insurance. I pay the massive monthly mortgage. I let them live here essentially rent-free, simply asking them to cover the basic water and electric utilities. And in return for saving their lives, my mother banished me to the cramped, unheated attic bedroom because the sprawling, beautifully renovated guest suite had to be kept absolutely pristine for when my sister decided to visit. They treated me like a burdensome, unwanted squatter in my own home, but I never threw the truth in their faces. I quietly swallowed my pride day after day to keep the peace, desperately hoping that maybe just once they would genuinely recognize my sacrifice and love me for it. Instead, their temporary gratitude quickly morphed into a toxic, deeply ingrained entitlement. They convinced themselves that because I lived in the attic and had no husband to occupy my time, my money, my schedule, and my physical energy belonged entirely to them. I looked down at the laminated list again. Page 2 detailed a highly complicated recipe for a wild mushroom and truffle risotto that required constant dedicated stirring for 45 straight minutes. I looked up at my father, who was now casually checking the time on his luxury watch, and then at my mother, who was busy checking her makeup reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. They did not see a loving daughter sitting at that island. They saw a household appliance. They saw a permanent safety net that they could comfortably step on with their designer shoes whenever they pleased. The absolute audacity of it all was suffocating. They fully expected me to wake up in the freezing dark of a holiday morning, scrub their silver, prepare a massive feast for their wealthy, judgmental friends, and probably eat my own cold dinner standing over the kitchen sink just so I would not take up a valuable seat at the main dining table. The anger that suddenly bloomed in my chest was not hot or explosive. It was freezing cold. It was the kind of crystal-clear, terrifyingly calm anger that suddenly makes the entire world make perfect sense. I did not scream at them. I did not cry. I did not point out the glaring hypocrisy of the roof comment. I just let the heavy silence stretch between us for a few long, defining seconds. I looked at the glossy list, and I realized that I was finally entirely done. The heavy oak front door suddenly swung open, hitting the entryway wall with a loud thud that made me jump. A bitter blast of freezing wind swept through the hallway, carrying with it the booming, overly confident voice of my brother-in-law Jamal and the sharp, complaining tone of my younger sister Stephanie. They did not walk into the house like people arriving to help prepare a massive holiday meal. They paraded in like celebrities arriving at a hotel. Stephanie bundled in a pristine white wool coat that cost more than my first car was struggling to balance 4 massive designer shopping bags. Jamal followed close behind, wearing a tailored topcoat and checking his smartwatch, carrying absolutely nothing but his own phone. There were no bags of groceries. There were no bottles of wine. There was not a single item meant to contribute to the Thanksgiving dinner that was supposedly happening in 12 hours. "Ah, it smells like absolutely nothing in here," Jamal announced as he strode into the kitchen, completely ignoring the tense atmosphere between me and my parents. He did not ask how my day was. He did not ask if I needed help. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper, and casually tossed it onto the kitchen counter right next to my father's laminated list. "Hey, Caroline," Jamal said, tapping the paper with his index finger. "Listen, I have 2 potential angel investors coming tomorrow to look at the prototype for my new boutique fitness app. These guys are flying in from New York, and they are big money. I need you to prepare a separate, fully vegan, gluten-free, soy-free menu for them. Oh, and make sure it is plated nicely on the good china, not the everyday stuff. We need to project an image of absolute premium luxury." I stared at the crumpled piece of paper, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his request. It was past 5 in the evening on the night before Thanksgiving. The grocery stores were either already closed or completely stripped bare of anything resembling specialty vegan ingredients. And Jamal, a man who had not held a steady paycheck in 4 years, while chasing one failed startup idea after another, was demanding a custom gourmet menu for 2 total strangers to help fund his latest delusion. Before I could even open my mouth to point out the impossibility of his demands, Stephanie dropped her heavy shopping bags onto the floor with an exhausted sigh and dramatically slumped onto one of the bar stools. "And please, Caroline," Stephanie chimed in aggressively, massaging her temples as if she were the one who had just worked a 60-hour week. "Do not burn the artisanal rolls this year. You completely ruined the catering at my baby shower last year with those charred pieces of rock, and my friends are still whispering about it. I cannot have Jamal's investors thinking we are incompetent hosts." The air in my lungs turned to ice. She actually brought up the baby shower. I looked at my younger sister taking in her perfectly manicured nails and her flawless blowout. What she conveniently left out of her little revisionist history was that I had paid $5,000 out of my own pocket to fund that extravagant baby shower because she and Jamal were completely broke. She had demanded a highly specific, overpriced organic baker from 3 towns over. When that baker overbooked and rushed the order delivering burned bread, Stephanie had immediately thrown a hysterical fit in front of all her wealthy friends. To protect her fragile ego and keep the peace, I had quietly taken the blame, apologizing to the guests and pretending I was the one who had messed up the oven temperatures. I paid for the entire event. I took the public humiliation, and a year later, she was using my sacrifice as a weapon to insult me in my own kitchen. I expected my parents to say something. I expected Thomas to look at the time and tell Jamal that asking for a custom vegan menu at the 11th hour was unreasonable. I expected Susan to remind Stephanie that I had already done enough. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Susan immediately rushed over to Stephanie, completely abandoning her previous annoyance with me. She began cooing over her youngest daughter, eagerly peering into the designer shopping bags to admire the expensive cashmere sweaters and silk scarves Stephanie had just bought, using money she supposedly did not have. "Oh, these are gorgeous, sweetheart," Susan gushed, stroking a scarf. "You definitely need to wear this tomorrow. It will look stunning in the family photos." Meanwhile, Thomas turned his full, undivided attention to Jamal, his face lighting up with genuine respect that he had never, not once, directed toward me. Angel investors, you say? Thomas asked, leaning against the counter and completely ignoring the impossible cooking lists piling up next to me. That is fantastic news, Jamal. I always knew this fitness app was going to be the breakthrough. How much capital are you asking them for? A clean million for the seed round, Jamal said casually, leaning back and crossing his arms, looking incredibly pleased with himself. That is why the presentation tomorrow has to be absolutely flawless. No distractions. Thomas nodded seriously, rubbing his chin as if they were discussing a massive corporate merger. Well, we need to make sure you have the proper environment to pitch them. The living room might be too noisy once the rest of the relatives arrive. Susan turned around, her eyes lighting up with a sudden terrible idea. Thomas, why do not we give Jamal, Stephanie, and the investors the master dining room all to themselves? They can close the double doors, have their custom meal in total peace, and really get down to business. The rest of the extended family can eat in the living room and the den. But what about Caroline? Thomas asked, not out of concern for me, but clearly trying to figure out the logistics of where the household servant would be stationed. She needs to be close to the oven to keep the courses coming. Oh, Caroline can just eat in here, Susan said dismissively, waving a hand toward the small kitchen island where I was currently standing. She can just plate her own food and eat right here at the counter. It makes the most sense anyway. She needs to be in the kitchen to make sure Jamal's investors have their water glasses refilled and their vegan plates cleared properly. It will give everyone else enough space. I stood there perfectly still, listening to the four of them actively plan my complete isolation. I was the one who bought the turkey. I was the one who bought the house they were standing in. I was the one whose credit profile was currently keeping the lights on and the heating running. Yet here they were excitedly plotting to banish me to eat a cold dinner alone at the kitchen counter like a hired maid entirely, so that my unemployed brother-in-law could play pretend businessman with his imaginary millions. Jamal clapped his hands together, looking thrilled. Perfect. That works out perfectly. Thanks, Susan. And Caroline seriously checked the labels on the vegan stuff. No cross-contamination with the turkey grease. Investors hate that. He did not wait for my response. He turned and walked out of the kitchen with Thomas, the two of them already deep in conversation about profit margins and market shares. Susan helped Stephanie gather her heavy shopping bags, linking arms with her golden child as they headed toward the grand staircase to try on the new clothes. Just make sure you set your alarm, Caroline. Susan called out over her shoulder without looking back. 5 in the morning, and do not forget to polish the silver tonight. They left me standing completely alone in the bright, silent kitchen. The only sound was the low hum of the massive refrigerator. I looked down at the granite counter. Sitting side by side were my father's 3-page laminated list and Jamal's crumpled piece of notebook paper. They were physical manifestations of my entire life in this family. Endless demands, zero respect, absolute entitlement. I reached out and slowly ran my fingers over the smooth plastic of the laminated pages. My heart was not racing. I was not holding back tears. The crushing exhaustion that had been weighing down my bones for the past 60 hours suddenly vanished, replaced by a profound electric sense of clarity. For 35 years, I had believed that if I just worked a little harder, sacrificed a little more, and made myself as useful as possible, they would eventually love me the way they loved Stephanie. But standing in that empty kitchen looking at the instructions for my own subjugation, I finally understood the truth. They did not love me. They loved what I could do for them. And if I stayed in this house for one more day, they would consume every last drop of my money, my energy, and my youth, until there was absolutely nothing left but an empty shell. I slowly pulled my hands away from the lists. I picked up my coffee mug, walked over to the sink, and quietly poured the cold liquid down the drain. I did not need to scream. I did not need to argue. Arguing with them would only validate their delusion that they held some kind of authority over my life. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking application. It was time to stop being the responsible daughter and start being the landlord. I barely had the banking application loaded on my phone screen when heavy footsteps marched right back down the hallway. Jamal reappeared in the kitchen doorway, holding his smartphone up and intensely scrolling through some pretentious fitness influencer page. My mother followed closely behind him, clutching a crystal wine glass she had just poured for herself in the dining room. "Hey, I forgot to mention," Jamal said, not even bothering to look up from his glowing screen. "The investors I am bringing tomorrow are very specific about their dietary needs. They do not just eat vegetables. You need to get cashew-based camembert and that aged almond Gouda from the organic market downtown. Oh, and make sure the wine pairing is entirely biodynamic. Do not get the cheap stuff, Caroline. My entire brand depends on this aesthetic." I slowly lowered my phone and placed it face down on the cold granite counter. I looked at this man, a 34-year-old serial failure who had not contributed a single dollar to the household in years, demanding I act as his personal gourmet caterer. "Jamal." "It is past 6 in the evening on the night before Thanksgiving," I said, keeping my voice incredibly level. "The organic market downtown closed an hour ago. Even if they were open, I do not have the time to drive 45 minutes into the city to source imported vegan cheeses. I already have a 3-page laminated list of cooking demands from my father that starts at 5 in the morning. I cannot do it." Jamal finally looked up from his phone. He did not look understanding. He did not look apologetic. He looked deeply offended, as if I had just insulted him on a profound personal level. He let out a loud, mocking scoff, shaking his head slowly. He turned to my mother, gesturing toward me with his free hand, as if I were a defective piece of machinery. "You see this?" Susan, Jamal asked, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "This is exactly what happens when you let her live at home at 35. No ambition, no hospitality, no vision. She cannot even handle a simple grocery run to support a high-stakes business dinner. It is pathetic. Honestly, I do not know how you deal with her negative energy under your roof." I turned my eyes to my mother, genuinely waiting for her to defend me. I waited for her to remind Jamal that I had just worked a punishing 60-hour week. I waited for her to tell him that he was completely out of line speaking to me that way. Instead, Susan took a slow, deliberate sip of her red wine. She crossed her arms, fixing me with a glare of pure, unadulterated disdain. "He is absolutely right, Caroline." My mother snapped, her tone sharp and venomous. "Your attitude lately has been completely unacceptable. We provide you with a beautiful roof over your head. We let you eat our food, and you complain about making a simple trip to the store to help your brother-in-law secure his future. If you cannot find it in your heart to contribute to this household, maybe you need to find somewhere else to live. We only have room here for family members who actually support one another. Find somewhere else to live." Those 6 words hung in the air, vibrating with a level of delusion so intense it almost made me dizzy. That was the moment. That was the exact fraction of a second where the final frayed thread tethering me to this toxic family snapped completely. A switch flipped inside my brain. The chronic anxiety, the crushing guilt, the desperate lifelong need for my mother to look at me the way she looked at Stephanie, it all evaporated. It was replaced by a strange, profound, and terrifyingly cold sense of peace. I looked at Jamal standing tall in his tailored designer topcoat. I knew for a fact that coat was paid for by a premium credit card, that I was quietly paying the minimum balance on every single month just to keep his account from going to collections. I looked at my mother standing proudly in a sprawling, beautifully decorated suburban kitchen. I knew for a fact that this entire house was legally registered to a limited liability company I owned. I had bought this property in cash from the bank to stop their foreclosure, saving them from total bankruptcy and social humiliation. They were standing in my house. They were wearing clothes bought with my credit. They were living lavishly on my dime, treating me like an unpaid, ungrateful servant, and now they had the absolute audacity to threaten me with eviction from my own property. I did not feel the urge to scream. I did not feel the familiar sting of frustrated tears in my eyes. I did not want to pull up the property deeds and slam them onto the counter to prove my ownership. Explaining the truth to them right then would only give them a chance to argue, to manipulate, to instantly play the victims and twist the narrative. I realized in that crystal clear moment that absolute power does not need to announce itself. True leverage is silent. I simply reached out and picked up the laminated prep list my father had given me, along with the crumpled piece of notebook paper Jamal had tossed down. I held the absurd demands in my hands, smoothed them out deliberately, and looked directly into my mother's eyes. I allowed a slow, serene smile to spread across my face. It was the first genuine smile I had worn in this house in years. "You are right," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and perfectly pleasant. "I have been completely selfish and ungrateful. I am so sorry. I will take care of everything. Do not worry about a single thing, either of you. Tomorrow is going to be a Thanksgiving that absolutely no one in this family will ever forget." Jamal smirked, clearly satisfied that his little display of dominance had successfully put me back in my place. He adjusted his collar and looked at his phone again. "That is what I thought," he muttered, turning on his heel. "Just have the dinner ready and plated by 1 o'clock sharp. And do not mess up the presentation." Susan gave me a curt, arrogant nod of approval. She took another sip of her wine, looking incredibly pleased with her parenting skills. "See, was that so hard, Caroline? A little gratitude and respect goes a long way in this world. Make sure you set your alarm." With that, they both walked out of the kitchen, their footsteps fading down the hallway. They held their heads high, entirely smug, fully believing they had won the battle. They believed they had successfully crushed my spirit. They had no idea that they had just handed me the match to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. I stood alone in the kitchen once more. The smile slowly faded from my face, replaced by a mask of pure, calculated focus. I dropped their ridiculous lists into the nearest trash can. I picked up my phone from the counter and unlocked the screen. The banking application was still open, waiting for my command. It was time to get to work. By 10 o'clock that night, the sprawling suburban house had settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sounds were the low rumble of the central heating system and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the temperature outside continued to plummet. My parents and my sister had long since retreated to their respective luxury bedrooms, completely confident that their designated servant was downstairs diligently beginning the massive mountain of prep work for their lavish Thanksgiving feast. They were partially right. I was in the kitchen and I was working, but I was not doing anything they had ordered me to do. I stood at the granite island under the dim, warm glow of the pendant lights. I pulled a single yellow onion from the pantry, placed it on the heavy wooden cutting board, and methodically chopped it into thick, uneven quarters. I did not bother peeling it perfectly. I tossed the rough pieces into the ceramic bowl of my slow cooker, filled it to the brim with tap water, and turned the dial to the low heat setting. Within an hour, the sharp, savory aroma of cooking onions would begin to drift through the entire house, seeping under their bedroom doors. It was a perfectly executed sensory illusion. When they briefly woke up in the middle of the night, they would smell the warm, comforting scent of food simmering. They would smile in their sleep, secure in the knowledge that I was awake, suffering, and following their exact commands. With the stage perfectly set and the slow cooker quietly bubbling in the corner, I wiped down the counter, pulled up a tall stool, and opened my laptop right next to my phone. It was time to execute the real preparation. I did not pull out recipes or roasting pans. Instead, I pulled up my master banking dashboard. The screen illuminated my face with a cold blue light, displaying the intricate, suffocating web of financial obligations that had kept me trapped in this house for years. My first target was the primary platinum credit account. I clicked on the transaction history and scrolled through the endless, infuriating list of charges. A $500 dinner at the country club, a $300 charge at a luxury day spa, $800 at a boutique golf pro shop. All of these were charged by Thomas and Susan. 5 years ago, when their credit scores had completely tanked due to their reckless spending, they had begged me to co-sign as the primary guarantor on a new account just so they could buy groceries. They promised it was only for absolute emergencies. Like every other promise they ever made to me, it was a blatant lie. I navigated to the account management settings. I clicked the tab labeled Guarantor Options. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs as I selected the option to formally remove my name and my income from the account. A warning prompt popped up on the screen, advising me that removing the primary guarantor would instantly freeze the credit line and require the remaining account holders to undergo an immediate credit check to keep the account active. Given that Thomas and Susan had absolutely no verifiable income and terrible credit history, the bank's automated system would lock the cards the second it processed the request. I did not hesitate. I typed in my security PIN and clicked Confirm. A green checkmark appeared. The financial umbilical cord to my parents was officially severed. Next, I opened the portal for the joint checking account I shared with my sister. This account was originally set up years ago when Stephanie was pretending to go to college, meant to be a safety net for textbooks and emergency rent. Naturally, she dropped out, but the account remained open. Over the past 3 years, it had quietly morphed into a personal slush fund that she and Jamal drained whenever his imaginary startups failed to generate cash. I looked at the current balance. There was exactly $4,000 in the account money that I had transferred from my own paycheck just 2 days ago to cover their upcoming car insurance premium. I clicked on the transfer button. I moved every single penny of that $4,000 straight back into my private individual savings account. The joint balance immediately dropped to zero. Then I went a step further. I knew from managing the family finances that Stephanie had a secret high-interest credit card entirely in her name. She had maxed it out to the tune of $80,000, funding designer bags and lavish vacations to project the image of a successful entrepreneur's wife. She thought Jamal did not know about it. She thought my parents did not know about it. She had been quietly siphoning money from our joint account for months just to make the minimum payments and keep the debt collectors at bay. By emptying the checking account and closing it entirely, I was essentially pulling the pin out of a massive financial grenade and dropping it squarely into her perfect, curated life. I clicked the final confirmation to permanently close the joint account. The screen refreshed. It was done. The digital chains that had bound me to their endless greed dissolved into nothingness. I closed my laptop and slid it into my leather work tote. I reached under the kitchen desk and pulled out the heavy-duty paper shredder. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the kitchen was the sharp, aggressive, mechanical whir of steel blades destroying years of enabling. I shredded courtesy copies of their car insurance policies. I shredded the extra household utility bills I had been paying on their behalf. I shredded every single piece of paper that tied my name to their daily survival. I bagged the shredded paper, tied the plastic tight, and shoved it deep into the bottom of the trash can. When the kitchen was completely spotless and the slow cooker was humming its deceptive tune, I picked up my tote bag and quietly made my way out of the kitchen. I walked up the grand, sweeping hardwood staircase. The thick plush carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps. As I reached the second-floor landing, I had to walk directly past the master guest suite. The heavy oak double doors were closed, but I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a television playing a late-night talk show accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic snoring of Jamal. Inside that room was a California king-sized bed with an imported memory foam mattress, an ensuite bathroom with a jacuzzi tub, and a walk-in closet currently filled with the designer clothes Stephanie had bought using my money. They were sleeping in absolute luxury in a house they did not own. I did not feel bitter anymore. I just felt a profound sense of detachment, like I was observing strangers in a documentary. I walked past their opulent door and continued toward the end of the hallway, where a narrow, steep set of wooden stairs led up to the attic. I pushed open the flimsy door to my bedroom. The air hit me instantly. It was at least 10 degrees colder up here than in the rest of the house. The attic had never been properly insulated. The ceiling sloped sharply, supported by exposed wooden beams that made the space feel cramped and claustrophobic. My bed was a simple twin-sized mattress pushed against the far wall, covered in two heavy quilts just to keep the winter chill away. This was the space my mother deemed appropriate for the person who had saved them from homelessness. I did not turn on the main overhead light. I used the small, warm glow of my bedside lamp. I reached under the bed and pulled out two large hard-shell travel suitcases. I unzipped them and laid them flat on the thin carpet. I packed with surgical precision. I did not throw things in frantically. I folded my professional work blouses, my tailored slacks, and my favorite casual sweaters. I packed my running shoes, my expensive skincare products, and the few pieces of genuine jewelry I had bought for myself over the years. I deliberately left behind every single cheap, thoughtless gift my family had ever given me. I left the ugly, oversized sweaters my mother bought me on clearance. I left the cheap, highly scented lotions Stephanie would re-gift me every Christmas. I only packed the items that represented the woman I had built myself to be. Finally, I opened the small fireproof lockbox I kept hidden in the back of the tiny closet. Inside were my passport, my birth certificate, and the thick stack of legal documents proving my absolute sole ownership of the limited liability company that held the deed to this property. I placed the lockbox securely in the center of my carry-on bag and zipped it shut. I stood up and looked around the cramped, freezing attic room one last time. There were no fond memories here. There was only the ghost of a desperate, exhausted daughter who had tried everything to buy her family's love. She did not live here anymore. I grabbed the handles of my suitcases fully packed and heavy with the promise of a new life. I clicked off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and quietly made my way back down the narrow stairs. The time for preparation was officially over. It was time to leave them the centerpiece of their holiday meal. The grandfather clock in the front hallway chimed a soft, muted 1:45 in the morning. I stood at the bottom of the stairs with my two heavy suitcases, my breathing slow and measured. The house was entirely still, wrapped in the deep, heavy sleep of people who had absolutely no responsibilities. The only thing disrupting the quiet was the faint, savory aroma of the single boiling onion wafting from the kitchen. It smelled exactly like a home where a devoted, subservient daughter was already slaving away over a hot stove to make their holiday dreams come true. It was the perfect disguise, a sensory trick to keep them comfortably asleep while I dismantled their reality. I left my suitcases standing neatly by the front door and walked down the short, shadowed hallway to the attached garage. The moment I opened the heavy fire door, the freezing overnight air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the heated comfort of the house. I flicked on the fluorescent overhead lights. The garage was pristine, housing my father's leased luxury sedan and Jamal's imported sports car. Neither of them knew that I had recently stopped paying the premium insurance policies on those vehicles. I walked past their shiny metal monuments of fake wealth and approached the large chest freezer tucked into the back corner. I lifted the heavy white lid. A thick cloud of icy vapor spilled over the edges, drifting down to the cold concrete floor. Reaching inside, I bypassed the expensive cuts of steak and the frozen artisan appetizers I had bought weeks ago. At the very bottom sat the centerpiece of their holiday delusion, the turkey. It was a massive 25-pound bird wrapped tightly in thick plastic netting. It was frozen, absolutely solid, heavy as a bowling ball and hard as a block of concrete. I hoisted it out with both hands, the freezing surface instantly biting through my thin sweater, and carried it back inside the house. I walked into the warm, softly lit kitchen and placed the frozen behemoth directly in the absolute center of the pristine granite kitchen island. The heavy thud of the frozen meat hitting the stone echoed loudly in the quiet room, but no one upstairs stirred. The turkey sat there, an icy pale rock, completely incapable of being cooked, thawed, or consumed for at least 3 full days. It looked incredibly absurd sitting on the beautiful countertop, slowly beginning to accumulate a thin layer of condensation under the warm glow of the pendant lights. I walked over to the trash can where I had thrown their ridiculous demands earlier. I reached in and pulled out my father's 3-page color-coded laminated prep list and Jamal's crumpled sheet of notebook paper demanding imported vegan cheese. I wiped a stray bit of coffee ground off the plastic. For a brief second, the old, deeply conditioned part of my brain wondered if I should write a note. I thought about leaving a long, emotional letter, explaining exactly why I was leaving, detailing the years of financial abuse, the emotional neglect, and the sheer exhaustion of trying to buy their love. But I quickly dismissed the thought. Toxic people do not read emotional letters to understand your pain or reflect on their own behavior. They read them to find loopholes. They read them to mock your feelings, to twist your words, and to figure out exactly how to manipulate you back into submission. Leaving a letter would give them something to argue against. I did not owe them an explanation. I only owed them exactly what they had asked for. I took the 2 pieces of paper and laid them flat against the broad, frozen breast of the turkey. Then I opened the heavy wooden block sitting next to the stainless steel stove and pulled out my favorite tool. It was a professional grade-high carbon steel carving knife with an 8-inch blade. I held the handle tightly, feeling the perfect deadly balance of its weight. I raised the knife and drove it forcefully downward. The sharp steel easily pierced through the laminated plastic of my father's list, tore violently through Jamal's notebook paper, and wedged itself an inch deep into the frozen flesh of the turkey. The knife stood straight up perfectly, pinning their absurd entitled demands directly to the ruined centerpiece of their perfect holiday. I stepped back and admired my work. It was not just a message. It was a monument to my resignation. It was a visual representation of 35 years of compliance finally snapping. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my heavy brass house key. This key represented my entire adult life. It represented the mortgage I paid, the property taxes I covered, and the crushing weight of their survival resting squarely on my shoulders. I dropped the key onto the granite counter right next to the turkey. The sharp clink of metal on stone felt like a gavel coming down in a silent courtroom. The verdict was final. I was done. Just as the key settled, a flash of warm yellow light swept across the sheer curtains of the kitchen window. I walked into the front hallway and looked through the glass sidelight of the heavy oak door. A premium black car SUV was pulling silently into the driveway, its headlights cutting cleanly through the darkness of the suburban street. My ride was exactly on time. I grabbed the handles of my 2 heavy suitcases. I did not look back up the sweeping wooden staircase. I did not feel a single pang of guilt, fear, or hesitation. I turned the deadbolt, pulled the front door open, and stepped out into the crisp, freezing November air. The cold wind immediately rushed through my hair, but it did not feel bitter. It felt incredibly clean. The driver, a sharply dressed man in a dark suit, immediately stepped out of the idling vehicle and moved toward me to take my bags. I thanked him quietly as he loaded my past into the spacious trunk. I turned around and looked at the sprawling brick colonial house one last time. The windows of the master guest suite on the second floor were completely dark. Stephanie and Jamal were up there sleeping soundly, dreaming of angel investors and luxury vacations. Down the hall, my parents were dreaming of country club prestige and social dominance. All of it was resting on a foundation of my stolen labor and my drained bank accounts. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath them had just vanished. I reached out and pulled the front door shut. The heavy metallic click of the latch locking into place sounded like a steel vault sealing forever. I walked down the driveway, the crunch of the frost under my boots serving as the only sound in the dead of night. I climbed into the warm, rich leather interior of the luxury SUV. The driver closed the door behind me, sealing me in a quiet, temperature-controlled bubble of absolute safety. "To the airport, please," I said, leaning back into the plush seat and closing my eyes. The car shifted into gear and glided smoothly down the street, moving silently past the manicured lawns and sleeping houses. I did not look out the window to watch my childhood prison fade away. I just listened to the quiet hum of the engine, feeling a profound, intoxicating wave of relief wash over my entire body. I was leaving the house, the frozen turkey, and my toxic family completely in the rearview mirror. My phone was fully charged in my purse, ready to capture the fallout, but for the next few hours, I was simply a woman going on a desperately needed vacation. The black car SUV glided to a smooth stop outside the sliding glass doors of the international terminal. I stepped out into the biting November wind one last time, tipping the driver generously as he unloaded my bags onto a luggage cart. Walking through the automatic doors, I was instantly enveloped by the bright, bustling warmth of the airport. The polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the soft hum of early morning travelers created a comforting background noise. I glanced up at the massive digital departure board glowing against the far wall. The bright red numbers in the corner read exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. Right at this exact second, miles away in the dark suburbs, my father's alarm clock was aggressively buzzing on his mahogany nightstand. I could perfectly picture Thomas rolling out of his expensive mattress, sliding his feet into his leather slippers, and walking to the top of the stairs. He would pause, inhaling deeply, fully expecting the rich, savory smell of roasting turkey and buttery herbs to be filling the entire house. He would smell the simmering slow cooker onion instead, smile to himself, and assume his obedient daughter was happily slaving away in the kitchen exactly as he had commanded. I smiled at the thought, turned away from the departure board, and walked straight toward the premium first-class check-in desk. There were no long, winding lines here. There were no screaming children or stressed families hauling oversized boxes. There was only a quiet, beautifully lit counter resting on a plush red carpet. The ticket agent, a woman with a warm smile and a perfectly pinned silk scarf, greeted me immediately. I handed her my passport. She did not look at me with pity, and she did not hand me a laminated list of chores. She simply typed a few keys, printed my heavy cardstock boarding pass, and told me that the exclusive departure lounge was waiting for me just past the priority security checkpoint. Navigating through security took less than 5 minutes. I walked into the premium lounge, a sprawling, quiet sanctuary filled with comfortable leather armchairs, ambient lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark tarmac. I ordered a double espresso and a fresh butter croissant, sitting by the glass and watching the massive jets being prepped for flight. I felt a profound, almost dizzying sense of lightness. I was not chopping vegetables. I was not scrubbing silver. I was just a woman having a quiet breakfast before a long flight. When the boarding announcement softly chimed over the speakers, I gathered my bags and walked down the jet bridge. The moment I stepped onto the plane, the lead flight attendant greeted me by name, taking my coat and guiding me to my seat. It was not just a seat. It was a private lay-flat pod in the first-class cabin. The space was meticulously designed with rich mahogany accents, a massive personal screen, and a thick, luxurious duvet resting on the footwell. I slid into the wide leather seat surrounded by a level of comfort that made my freezing, cramped attic room feel like a distant, terrible nightmare. This specific flight was taking me to a 5-star, ultra-luxury, adults-only resort tucked away in the lush mountains of St. Lucia. I had booked a private villa with its own infinity pool overlooking the Caribbean Sea. I had also prepaid for daily deep tissue massages, private chef dinners on the beach, and a premium unlimited beverage package. It was without a doubt the most extravagant, expensive trip I had ever planned in my entire 35 years of existence. And the absolute best part of this spectacular vacation was exactly how I had funded it. 3 weeks ago, Jamal had cornered me in the kitchen while I was making my morning coffee. He had aggressively slapped a glossy, professionally printed brochure onto the counter detailing his latest boutique fitness application. He did not ask for my support. He demanded it. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that as his family, it was my obligation to provide him with a $15,000 seed investment. When I politely declined, citing my own savings goals, he threw an absolute tantrum. He told me that since I was unmarried and had no children, my money was just sitting around doing nothing useful. My parents had immediately rushed into the kitchen, taking his side, calling me incredibly selfish and narrow-minded for not believing in his entrepreneurial spirit. They wanted $15,000. So I took exactly $15,000 out of my savings account and used every single penny of it to book this first-class ticket and the luxury St. Lucia villa. Every sip of premium wine I was about to drink, every ocean sunset I was about to watch, and every hour of peace I was about to experience was directly funded by Jamal's rejected seed money. It was a deeply poetic financial transaction. The flight attendant appeared at my pod holding a silver tray with a crystal flute filled with pale, bubbling liquid. A glass of vintage pre-flight champagne to start your morning. "Miss Caroline," she asked with a bright smile. I took the cold glass by the stem. "Thank you so much," I replied. I took a slow sip. The champagne was crisp cold and tasted like absolute victory. I placed the glass on the sleek console next to my elbow and pulled my smartphone out of my leather tote bag. The cabin doors were closed and the safety demonstration was beginning. It was time to set up the digital perimeter. I swiped down on my screen and tapped the settings icon. I immediately switched my phone into the strict Do Not Disturb mode. I did not want my peaceful flight interrupted by a barrage of aggressive phone calls, screaming voicemails, or frantic text messages making my phone vibrate endlessly against the console. I wanted total silence on my end. However, I went into the application settings and carefully created two specific exceptions to the Do Not Disturb rule. First, I unmuted the notifications for the family group chat, ironically named Family First. The last message in the thread was sent by Susan at around 9 o'clock the previous night. It read, "Caroline, do not forget to take the good china out of the high cabinets tonight so you do not make noise in the morning." I left the chat open, pushing it to the background so I would see every single text bubble the moment it was sent. Second, I unmuted the alerts for the home security application. Last year, after my mother had a brief wave of paranoia about package thieves and neighborhood security, she demanded that I pay a professional company to install a premium Ring camera system inside and outside the house. I had purchased the top-tier package. One of those high-definition cameras was mounted directly in the corner of the kitchen, providing a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of the granite island, the stove, and the hallway entrance. It was equipped with motion sensors, night vision, and a highly sensitive microphone. I had originally installed it to give them peace of mind. Today, it was going to serve as my personal front-row ticket to the greatest show on Earth. I connected my phone to the aircraft's high-speed satellite internet network, paying the exorbitant fee without batting an eye. I wanted to make absolutely sure that even when I was 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, I would not miss a single frame of the footage. The massive jet engines roared to life, vibrating through the floorboards as the plane pushed back from the gate. I reclined my seat just a few inches, making myself perfectly comfortable. I pulled the plush duvet over my legs and rested my head against the soft pillow. Outside the small, oval window, the sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, painting the Chicago skyline in brilliant streaks of bright pink and deep orange. The bitter cold of the city was fading away, soon to be replaced by the tropical heat of the Caribbean. The plane taxied down the runway, gathered speed, and finally lifted off the ground. The heavy gravitational pull pressed me back into my seat, a physical reminder that I was finally leaving it all behind. We pierced through the thick gray morning clouds, breaking out into the blinding, beautiful sunlight of the upper atmosphere. I took another long sip of my champagne and placed my phone securely on the armrest. The screen was dark, completely silent. But I knew the motion sensors were active. I knew the camera was armed. The frozen 25-pound turkey was sitting right there in the middle of the kitchen, waiting patiently under the warm pendant lights with the carving knife sticking out of its chest. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady, comforting hum of the airplane engines. The trap was perfectly set. The timer was rapidly ticking down. Any minute now, someone was going to wake up, walk down those wooden stairs, and step into the kitchen to check on their unpaid servant. I was ready. The first 2 hours of the flight were a masterclass in absolute tranquility. I reclined in my plush leather seat, watching the brilliant blue of the ocean stretch out endlessly below me. I had just finished a beautifully plated breakfast of fresh fruit and warm pastries when the glowing screen of my smartphone resting on the console finally sprang to life. The digital clock in the upper corner of the screen rolled over to exactly 7:30 in the morning Central Standard Time. Right on schedule, the trap I had carefully laid in the freezing Chicago suburbs snapped shut. My phone vibrated with a short, sharp buzz. A text message notification popped up on the lock screen from the Family First group chat. It was from my mother. Caroline, why is the oven not turned on? I smell the onions cooking, but the kitchen is freezing. We talked about this. You need to preheat the oven early for a bird that size. I did not touch the phone. I just sat there taking a slow sip of my fresh coffee and watched the screen. Less than a minute later, a second text message appeared, this time from my father. Caroline, get down here right now. Your mother is calling for you. Do not make me come upstairs. The utter entitlement radiating from those few short sentences was staggering. They were not concerned that I might be sick or that I had perhaps overslept after working a 60-hour week. Their only concern was the temperature of their oven and the immediate obedience of their live-in servant. I smiled, unlocked my phone, and opened the smart home security application. The Ring camera interface loaded in an instant, utilizing the high-speed satellite internet of the aircraft. I tapped the live feed icon for the main kitchen camera. The high-definition video buffered for a fraction of a second before bringing the entire scene into crystal-clear focus. The kitchen was bathed in the pale gray light of the early winter morning. The house was perfectly quiet, save for the faint, steady bubbling of the slow cooker sitting on the far counter. Then Susan walked into the frame. My mother was wearing a long, expensive silk robe, her hair wrapped tightly in a silk scarf. She marched into the kitchen with an expression of deep irritation etched across her face. I turned the media volume on my phone all the way up, pressing the speaker close to my ear to catch every single sound. The microphone on the security camera was incredibly sensitive, picking up the sharp slap of her bare feet against the cold hardwood floor. She walked straight past the kitchen island without looking at it, heading directly for the stainless steel stove. She placed her hand against the glass door of the oven, confirming it was completely cold. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh of frustration. She turned around, placing her hands on her hips, fully prepared to yell up the stairs to my attic bedroom. That was when her eyes finally registered what was sitting directly in the center of the granite island behind her. Through the crisp video feed, I watched the exact moment my mother's brain tried to process the surreal image in front of her. There, sitting directly under the pendant lights, was the massive 25-pound turkey. It was still wrapped in its thick plastic netting, completely raw and frozen, absolutely solid. Frost had gathered across its surface, and a small pool of icy condensation had formed on the pristine stone countertop beneath it. But the turkey was not the most shocking part. Driven deep into the center of the frozen breast was my large steel carving knife, perfectly pinning Thomas's laminated prep list and Jamal's crumpled vegan menu to the bird. Susan stood completely paralyzed for 3 full seconds. Her jaw dropped open. Then a genuine high-pitched shriek ripped from her throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock, echoing loudly through the microphone and directly into my earpiece, 30,000 feet in the air. Thomas, she screamed, her voice cracking with sheer panic. Thomas, get down here right now. Oh my God! Heavy, frantic footsteps thundered down the wooden staircase. Within seconds, my father rushed into the camera frame. He was wearing his plaid pajama pants and a white undershirt, his face flushed red with alarm. He skidded into the kitchen, his eyes wildly scanning the room for an intruder or a fire. What is it? What happened? Thomas demanded, grabbing Susan by the shoulders. Susan could not form a coherent sentence. She just raised a shaking hand and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the kitchen island. Thomas turned his head. The camera captured his expression, morphing rapidly from defensive alarm to profound, utter confusion. He slowly walked up to the island, staring at the frozen monument I had left for them. He reached out tentatively, and touched the cold steel handle of the carving knife. He read the top of his own laminated list, which was now damp with turkey condensation. "What the hell is this?" Thomas muttered, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "Where is she, Caroline?" The commotion had successfully woken up the golden child and her husband. More footsteps echoed from the grand staircase. Jamal and Stephanie stumbled into the kitchen view, both wearing matching luxury designer loungewear. Stephanie was rubbing her eyes, looking incredibly annoyed that her beauty sleep had been interrupted, while Jamal was holding his smartphone, already complaining. "Can you guys keep it down?" Jamal whined, completely oblivious to the scene unfolding in front of him. "My investors are coming in a few hours, and I need to be completely rested. Why is it so cold in here? Is breakfast ready yet?" Thomas spun around, his face purple with absolute rage. "Does this look like breakfast is ready? Jamal? Look at the counter." Jamal and Stephanie finally looked at the granite island. Stephanie let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Jamal physically took a step backward, his eyes wide. "Did she do that?" Stephanie asked, her voice trembling. "Did Caroline do that?" "That is insane. Where is she go? Check her room." Thomas barked at Stephanie, his authoritative facade completely cracking under the pressure of the ruined holiday. "Go up to the attic right now and drag her down here. I am going to wring her neck. This is completely unacceptable." Stephanie turned and sprinted out of the camera frame, her bare feet slapping against the wood. For the next 2 minutes, the kitchen was filled with a tense, heavy silence. Susan began pacing back and forth, wringing her hands together, muttering under her breath about the country club board members and the social humiliation they were about to endure. Jamal just stood there staring at the knife, slowly realizing that his highly specific imported vegan menu was absolutely not going to happen. Then Stephanie's voice echoed down the stairs. It was not a voice of anger. It was a voice laced with genuine panic. "Dad," she screamed from the second-floor landing. "Dad, she is not up here." "What do you mean she is not up there?" Thomas yelled back, walking into the hallway. "Her bed is completely stripped." Stephanie shouted, her voice growing louder as she ran back down the stairs and burst back into the kitchen. "Her closet is entirely empty. All her work clothes are gone. Her suitcases are gone. Her winter coats are gone. She is not in the house." The four of them stood in a tight circle in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the beautiful, expensive appliances I had paid for, finally realizing the sheer magnitude of their situation. The live-in servant had not just thrown a tantrum, the live-in servant had completely abandoned her post. But instead of self-reflection, instead of realizing that they had pushed me over the edge with their relentless demands and blatant disrespect, their minds immediately defaulted to extreme entitlement. They still believed they held the ultimate power in our dynamic. They still believed that if they just yelled loud enough, I would come running back to fix everything. My phone vibrated violently against my palm. I minimized the Ring camera application and opened the Family First group chat. The screen began to scroll rapidly as a barrage of frantic text messages flooded in. The tone had completely shifted from annoyed demands to panicked aggression. "Stephanie, where the hell are you? The relatives arrive at 1 p.m. You cannot do this to us, Thomas. Caroline, this is not funny. You are ruining Thanksgiving. Come back to the house immediately. We can talk about whatever is bothering you, but you need to cook this turkey. Jamal, Caroline, my investors are arriving in 5 hours. You committed to making a vegan menu. You are acting completely unprofessionally and jeopardizing my entire future. Answer your phone right now." "Susan, how could you do this to your own family? The country club board is coming. What am I supposed to tell them? You are acting like a spoiled, selfish child. Come home. Now." I sat back in my luxurious first-class seat, reading their desperate messages, while the bright Caribbean sun began to stream through the airplane window. They were drowning in a glass of water entirely of their own making. They were staring at a frozen turkey, 25 hungry guests on the horizon, and a complete lack of basic survival skills. I did not type a reply. I did not send a witty comeback. The most powerful response I could possibly give them right now was absolute deafening silence. I let the text messages pile up, watching them spiral further and further into absolute chaos. I locked my phone screen, placed it gently on the console, and asked the flight attendant for another hot cup of coffee. The awakening was complete, but the true nightmare for my family was only just beginning. By the time my plane touched down on the sun-baked tarmac of the international airport in St. Lucia, the situation back in Chicago had devolved from a state of shocked confusion into an outright logistical meltdown. I stepped off the aircraft and was immediately greeted by the thick, sweet tropical air. The biting winter winds of the Midwest, the gray skies, and the suffocating tension of my childhood home were instantly replaced by a gentle, warm ocean breeze. That breeze carried the faint scent of salt, blooming hibiscus, and absolute freedom. I breezed through customs, my carry-on bag, and perfectly packed suitcases trailing smoothly behind me. A private air-conditioned luxury sedan was waiting for me at the curb arranged by the resort. During the scenic drive through the lush emerald green mountains of the island, my phone remained completely silent on its undisturbed setting, though I knew the digital notifications were silently stacking up by the minute. When I finally arrived at my exclusive oceanfront villa, the concierge greeted me by name, handing me an ice-cold lavender-scented towel and a freshly cut coconut adorned with a vibrant orchid. I walked out onto my private, sprawling teak terrace, dropped my heavy leather tote onto a plush white sunbed, and looked out over the endless glittering expanse of the Caribbean Sea. The water was a brilliant, impossible shade of turquoise, gently lapping against the pristine white sand beach just a few steps below my balcony. I stripped off my heavy travel clothes, slipped into a light flowing linen sundress, and finally sat down to check the digital carnage unfolding thousands of miles away. I unlocked my phone, and the screen instantly populated with dozens upon dozens of new notifications. In the hours it took for me to fly over the ocean and settle into my tropical paradise, my family had not spent a single second wondering if I was physically safe. There were no messages asking if I had been in a terrible accident, if I was in a hospital, or if I had suffered a mental breakdown. Their entire focus remained violently, obsessively fixated on themselves and their immediate social crisis. Their denial was so deeply ingrained that they genuinely could not process the idea that I had left them permanently. They were treating my deliberate disappearance not as a definitive severing of ties, but as an incredibly inconvenient administrative error that I was still fully obligated to fix from wherever I was hiding. Jamal was the loudest, most aggressive voice in the family group chat, his panic completely overriding any semblance of reality. He sent a rapid-fire string of massive text blocks, each one more unhinged and demanding than the last. "Caroline, this is incredibly unprofessional." He typed, completely ignoring the fact that I was his sister-in-law, not his hired employee. "My investors are arriving at 1 o'clock sharp. Do you have any idea how much money is on the line today? Send me the details for your corporate American Express card right now so I can hire a private emergency chef. There is a high-end catering service downtown that can send a full culinary team over if we pay the premium holiday rush fee. I need the billing zip code and the security code immediately. My investors cannot see this mess." I read his words while a uniformed resort attendant quietly placed a silver tray of fresh mango-sliced papaya and a chilled glass of sparkling water on the small table beside my lounge chair. Jamal's absolute delusion was genuinely fascinating to witness from a safe distance. He was a 34-year-old man who had never successfully launched a single business, aggressively demanding the corporate credit card of a woman he had just openly insulted 12 hours ago. He truly believed that his imaginary fitness application took precedence over my basic human dignity. He actually thought I would hand over a limitless line of credit so he could play pretend billionaire in a house he did not even own. Right beneath Jamal's frantic, entitled demands were furious messages from my father. Thomas was seething, his texts reading like formal reprimands from a tyrannical corporate boss who had just caught a subordinate slacking off on company time. "You are acting like a spoiled child, Caroline." He wrote the digital words practically vibrating with his signature condescension. I do not care what kind of emotional breakdown you are having, but you do not ever walk out on family obligations. Call me immediately. I have the country club events manager on the other line right now. They can rush an emergency holiday order over to the house by noon, but they need an active premium card on file. Pay for the catering right now, and we can discuss your unacceptable behavior when you decide to come home and act like an adult. Susan chimed in immediately after him, perfectly playing the role of the deeply wounded matriarch. How could you be so utterly selfish? She texted. I have 25 people expecting a flawless holiday experience. Aunt Martha is driving 4 hours to get here. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire family. Stop this ridiculous tantrum and wire the money for the food before the country club kitchen stops taking emergency orders. We are running out of time. Even Stephanie added her own incredibly vain perspective. Caroline, you are ruining my Thanksgiving aesthetic. I bought a brand new outfit for these family photos. You need to fix this right now, or I am never speaking to you again. I set my smartphone down on the smooth teak table. I did not type a single letter in response. I did not try to defend myself, explain my actions, or point out the glaring hypocrisy of their demands. I simply leaned back against the plush, comfortable cushions of my sunbed and closed my eyes. The absolute contrast between their suffocating, frantic reality and my current environment was incredibly intoxicating. Thousands of miles away, in a freezing, tense suburban house, 4 grown adults were pacing rapidly around a cold kitchen, sweating with genuine panic, staring at a rock-solid frozen turkey they had absolutely no idea how to cook. They were frantically trying to figure out how to maintain their grand illusion of wealth capability and social competence without my wallet to silently prop them up. They were slowly realizing that their entire social standing, their comfort, and their holiday rested entirely on the shoulders of the daughter they treated like a disposable servant. They were trapped in a prison of their own design, entirely reliant on someone they had pushed completely away. Meanwhile, I was enveloped in absolute luxurious peace. I could hear the rhythmic, soothing crash of the warm ocean waves breaking against the pristine shore just beyond my terrace. I could feel the radiant, healing heat of the Caribbean sun warming my bare shoulders, slowly melting away the deep, bone-chilling tension I had carried in my muscles for over a decade. A brightly colored tropical bird chirped softly from a nearby palm tree, blending beautifully with the faint acoustic music playing from the distant resort lobby. The air tasted clean and incredibly sweet. There were no laminated prep lists hovering over my head. There were no ridiculous demands for imported vegan cheese or perfectly polished silver. There was absolutely no one telling me I was ungrateful, unaccommodating, or unworthy of respect. For the first time in my entire adult life, my time, my energy, and my money belonged entirely and exclusively to me. They desperately wanted me to fix their self-inflicted emergency from afar, clinging to the belief that I would eventually cave to their pressure. They were about to learn the hard way that my charity had permanently dried up, and the silence I was giving them was just a small preview of the total financial and emotional collapse heading directly for their front door. The morning drifted by in a state of absolute, uninterrupted perfection. I lay on the plush white cushions of my sunbed, letting the radiant Caribbean heat bake the years of accumulated stress completely out of my bones. A gentle rhythmic breeze carried the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine across my private terrace. Down on the pristine beach, a few resort guests were wading into the crystal-clear turquoise water, completely unbothered by the crushing demands of the holiday season. Every time a uniformed attendant quietly approached, it was not to hand me a laminated list of impossible chores or demand that I scrub the silver. It was to offer me a chilled eucalyptus towel, a fresh skewer of tropical fruit, or a perfectly mixed cocktail. I was experiencing the exact level of premium hospitality that my family so desperately believed they were entitled to receive from me. Back in the freezing gray suburbs of Chicago, the digital clock on my smartphone slowly crept toward 11 in the morning. The deadline for disaster was rapidly approaching. My family had exactly 2 hours before 25 hungry relatives and two high-profile angel investors were scheduled to walk through the heavy oak front door. I watched the screen of my phone as the tone of the Family First group chat began to undergo a fascinating psychological shift. For the first few hours, their messages had been dripping with their usual aggressive authority. They had commanded me to fix the situation genuinely, believing that I was just throwing a temporary dramatic tantrum. They assumed that if they yelled loud enough through the screen, my lifelong conditioning would kick in, and I would obediently hand over my corporate credit card to save them from embarrassment. But as the clock struck 10:45, the reality of their absolute helplessness finally began to set in. The window to order emergency catering from the country club or the luxury downtown steakhouse was slamming shut. Thomas was the first to completely lose his composure. His texts shifted from cold corporate commands to desperate, transparent threats. Caroline, the country club, just told me they cannot accommodate a rush order without an immediate wire transfer. He wrote the digital letters, practically screaming his panic. If you do not call me in the next 5 minutes and pay for this food, I am writing you out of my will. I will disown you. You will never see a single penny of this family's estate. I actually laughed out loud at that message. The sheer towering irony of a man threatening to cut me out of an estate that I secretly owned and paid for was almost too beautiful to comprehend. He had absolutely nothing to leave me, except a mountain of debt, yet he still clung desperately to the illusion of his patriarchal power. Susan followed up with a voice memo. Even though I was thousands of miles away, I could not resist tapping the play button. Her voice filled the warm, tropical air, sounding strained, breathless, and incredibly high-pitched. "Caroline, please stop doing this," she pleaded, her voice cracking with genuine terror. "Aunt Martha just texted me that she is an hour away. The house smells like a single boiled onion. The turkey is still rock solid. Stephanie is crying in the bathroom because her holiday aesthetic is ruined. Just give Jamal the credit card number. Please do not humiliate us like this." Jamal had resorted to sending single frantic words in rapid succession. "Please. Caroline. The investors. Pick up. Hello." They were drowning. They were standing in a beautiful, expensive kitchen that they did not own, surrounded by premium appliances they did not know how to use, entirely paralyzed by their own absolute incompetence. They had spent years treating me like an unpaid catering service, never bothering to learn how to roast a bird, set a formal table, or manage a crisis. They had built their entire social standing on my silent, exhausted labor, and now the foundation had vanished beneath their feet. The digital clock rolled over to exactly 11 o'clock. The timing was perfect. I sat up on my sunbed and adjusted my flowing linen sundress. The lighting on my private terrace was absolutely flawless, casting a warm golden glow across my face. A server had just delivered a fresh mimosa in a tall crystal flute, the glass beaded with icy condensation. I picked up the drink, held it up slightly, and switched my phone camera to the front-facing lens. I looked at my own reflection on the screen, and for the first time in over a decade, I genuinely recognized the woman looking back at me. The heavy, dark circles that usually hung under my eyes from working 60-hour weeks and managing my family's endless crises were completely gone. The tight, anxious set of my jaw had relaxed. My skin was glowing in the tropical sunlight. I looked rested, radiant, and incredibly powerful. I did not look like the miserable, beaten-down family doormat who lived in a freezing attic. I looked exactly like a successful 35-year-old director of supply chain logistics who had finally reclaimed her entire life. I offered the camera a bright, genuine, and unapologetically serene smile. I pressed the shutter button. The photo was absolutely perfect. I opened the Family First group chat. The cursor blinked steadily in the text box, waiting for my final contribution to their chaotic downward spiral. I attached the beautiful sun-drenched selfie of me holding the mimosa, with the vast, glittering expanse of the Caribbean Ocean stretching out endlessly in the background. I did not write a long emotional paragraph explaining my pain. I did not demand an apology for the years of financial abuse and emotional neglect. I did not even bother addressing Jamal's ridiculous demands for vegan cheese or my father's empty threats of disownment. True power does not explain itself. True power simply states the facts and walks away. I tapped the keyboard slowly and deliberately, typing out exactly 10 words. I quit. The turkey is on the counter. Happy Thanksgiving. I hit the send button. I watched the small progress bar shoot across the top of the screen. The image and the caption delivered instantly. The read receipts immediately popped up beneath my message. Thomas read it. Susan read it. Stephanie read it. Jamal read it. For exactly 15 agonizing seconds, the group chat was entirely dead. There were no typing bubbles. There were no frantic voice memos. I could vividly imagine the four of them standing frozen around the kitchen island, staring down at their glowing phone screens, their minds completely shattering as they processed the image. They were looking at the crystal-clear ocean. They were looking at my relaxed, smiling face. They were finally realizing that I was not hiding in a local hotel waiting for an apology. I was in another country completely out of their reach, and I had absolutely no intention of ever coming back to save them. Then the explosion happened. The chat lit up like a fireworks display of pure, unadulterated rage. All four of them began typing simultaneously. The text messages flooded in so fast that the screen could barely keep up. Thomas, you ungrateful wretch, do not ever show your face in this house again. You are dead to me, Stephanie. You are a complete psychopath. You planned this. You wanted to ruin my life and humiliate Jamal. You are sick, Jamal. You are getting sued for this. Caroline, I am holding you personally liable for any lost investment capital. You are a complete failure, Susan. How could you be so evil? The country club will hear about this. You are no daughter of mine. The vitriol was astounding, but it did not hurt me. It did not make my chest tighten with anxiety or fill my stomach with guilt. Reading their furious, hateful messages only confirmed exactly what I had realized the night before. They did not miss their daughter. They did not miss their sister. They only missed their wallet and their maid. They were furious because their favorite punching bag had finally decided to hit back by simply removing herself from the ring. I watched the insults roll in for another minute, sipping my cold mimosa and enjoying the absolute sheer panic hiding beneath their angry words. They could scream and threaten all they wanted through the digital void, but it did not change their physical reality. They were still 2 hours away from total social annihilation, and they still did not have a single scrap of food to serve their wealthy guests. I gently locked the screen of my phone, cutting off the endless stream of notifications, and placed the device face down on the teak table. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the ocean air. "Excuse me," I called out softly to a passing resort attendant. "Yes, Miss Caroline," he asked, stepping over with a warm smile. "I would love to order the blackened shrimp tacos and another mimosa, whenever you have a moment," I said. "And please take your time. I am in absolutely no rush today." He nodded gracefully and walked away toward the beachfront kitchen. I laid my head back against the cushion and closed my eyes once more, listening to the gentle rustle of the palm fronds above me. The first boundary had been successfully dropped and the initial shockwave had leveled their egos. But as I relaxed in the tropical heat, I knew the true punishment had not even begun yet. The real show was scheduled for 1 o'clock when 25 hungry relatives and 2 millionaire investors would walk into that freezing suburban house, expecting a feast only to find a frozen bird, a ruined family, and a house of cards that was just minutes away from a total financial collapse. Exactly at 1 o'clock in the afternoon Central Standard Time, I set my empty taco plate on the teak table and picked up my smartphone. The tropical sun was beating down on my terrace, warming my skin, but my attention was entirely focused on the digital window into the freezing Chicago suburbs. I opened the smart home security application and tapped into the live feed for the front entryway and the main living room. It was time for the main event. Through the crisp, high-definition lens of the outdoor doorbell camera, I watched a steady parade of vehicles pull into the long driveway. There were sensible family sedans, luxury sports utility vehicles, and finally a sleek black town car. The relatives were arriving. Aunt Martha stepped out of her car first, wearing her signature heavy fur coat and a deeply judgmental scowl, carrying a single cheap bottle of wine wrapped in a metallic gift bag. Behind her came a flood of cousins, uncles, and the affluent members of the country club board my mother had so desperately wanted to impress. Then the rear doors of the black town car opened, and two men in immaculate tailored charcoal suits stepped out into the biting winter wind. These were Jamal's highly anticipated angel investors, flying in all the way from New York, expecting a premium vegan feast and $1 million business pitch. I switched the video feed to the indoor foyer camera. The heavy oak front door swung open, and the freezing wind swept into the house, followed immediately by the loud, chaotic chatter of 25 hungry guests. They stomped their boots on the welcome mat, peeling off their heavy winter coats and thick scarves. Normally, walking into our house on Thanksgiving meant being instantly enveloped by the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasting turkey, warm butter, baking bread, and sweet cinnamon. It was a smell that commanded immediate comfort and anticipation. But today, the foyer smelled like absolutely nothing, save for the faint, pathetic, and distinctly sour odor of a single yellow onion that had been boiling in a slow cooker for the past 14 hours. I watched Aunt Martha pause midway through taking off her gloves. She sniffed the air aggressively, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. The investors exchanged a subtle, unreadable glance. The complete lack of culinary evidence was instantly unsettling to everyone in the room. My mother rushed into the camera frame to intercept the crowd before they could wander toward the kitchen. Susan had clearly spent the last hour desperately trying to repair her appearance. She was wearing her expensive silk cocktail dress and her heavy pearl necklace, and her hair was perfectly sprayed into place. But her eyes told a completely different story. They were wide, frantic, and underlined with the tight, manic energy of a woman standing on the edge of a cliff. She clasped her hands together tightly and raised her voice to address the crowded hallway, forcing a bright, painfully unnatural smile onto her face. "Welcome, everyone, welcome!" Susan announced, her voice pitching up an entire octave. "Please come into the living room. We are so thrilled you are here." Now I must apologize in advance because we have had the most dreadful, unavoidable morning. I leaned closer to my phone screen, taking a sip of my cold mimosa, incredibly eager to hear exactly how she was going to spin the frozen turkey sitting on the counter. Susan placed a dramatic hand over her heart and let out a long, theatrical sigh. Our premium caterer had a catastrophic emergency this morning. She lied smoothly, not missing a single beat. A terrible kitchen fire at their downtown facility. And if that was not stressful enough, poor Caroline had a sudden, severe mental breakdown. Aunt Martha gasped loudly, pressing a hand to her cheek. The other relatives murmured in shocked unison. "Yes, it is just tragic," Susan continued, shaking her head with fake sorrow. The pressure of her corporate job finally became too much for her to handle. She completely snapped early this morning and just ran off. We have been so worried sick about her that we barely had time to formulate a backup plan for the dinner. We are just so embarrassed, but family comes first, and we are just praying she gets the psychiatric help she desperately needs. I sat on my sunbed under the Caribbean sun, absolutely marveling at the sheer terrifying ease with which my mother threw me completely under the bus. To save her own fragile ego and protect her country club reputation, she did not just lie about a caterer. She publicly diagnosed me with a severe mental illness and painted herself as the heartbroken, long-suffering matriarch. She used my supposed psychiatric collapse as a convenient shield to hide the fact that she did not know how to turn on her own oven. Jamal stepped into the frame next, zeroing in on the two men in the tailored suits. He was wearing his designer outfit, but dark patches of sweat were already forming under his arms. He reached out to shake their hands, laughing nervously. "Gentlemen, so glad you made it," Jamal said, his voice dripping with forced confidence. "As Susan mentioned, my personal chef had a massive family emergency this morning. Completely unprofessional, but what can you do? We are handling it. Let us get you situated in the living room, and I will show you the initial wireframes for the application." The two investors did not look sympathetic. They looked hungry, cold, and profoundly unimpressed. They had been promised a high-stakes business dinner, not a chaotic suburban family drama. They nodded politely, but their body language was entirely closed off as Jamal ushered them toward the sitting area. I switched the camera view to the wide-angle lens covering the main living room and the adjacent formal dining room. The visual was absolutely devastating. 25 people were slowly filtering into the living space, taking seats on the plush velvet sofas and expensive armchairs. But standing right behind them, fully visible to everyone in the room, was the grand mahogany dining table. It was completely bare. There was no polished silver. There were no crystal wine glasses. There were no expensive floral centerpieces. It was just a massive empty expanse of dark wood, silently mocking every single person in the room. The social tension was so thick and heavy, it felt like it could shatter the camera lens. Guests sat rigidly in their chairs. There was no background music playing. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the awkward hollow clinking of ice cubes in water glasses that Thomas was frantically handing out like a desperate flight attendant. People were starving. They had skipped breakfast in anticipation of a massive holiday feast, and now their stomachs were audibly rumbling in the quiet room. I watched Aunt Martha lean over to one of my cousins, leaning behind her hand to whisper loudly. "For a woman who cares so much about appearances, you would think Susan would know how to order a simple backup ham," she muttered. Her voice picked up perfectly by the sensitive microphone. "This is an absolute disaster. I should have stayed home." In the corner of the room, Jamal was failing spectacularly. He was holding a sleek tablet computer, desperately trying to swipe through a presentation of his fitness app, speaking rapidly about market shares and user acquisition. But the two angel investors were barely looking at the screen. One of them was repeatedly checking his heavy gold wristwatch, while the other was staring blankly at the empty dining room table, clearly calculating how soon they could politely leave and find a restaurant that was actually open on Thanksgiving. The sheer suffocating social humiliation was settling over my parents and my brother-in-law like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every second that ticked by on the grandfather clock in the hallway eroded another piece of their fake empire. They were being quietly, brutally judged by the very people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. Thomas was pacing back and forth near the archway of the kitchen, his face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control and endless wealth. He could not stand the whispering. He could not stand the pitying looks from the country club board members. He could not stand the fact that he was failing publicly in his own home. I watched him suddenly stop pacing. He straightened his posture, puffed out his chest, and clapped his hands together loudly, demanding the attention of the entire room. The desperate, frantic look in his eyes had been replaced by a familiar, arrogant determination. He had clearly decided that he was going to buy his way out of this embarrassment completely, forgetting that he was playing with a deck of cards that I had already burned to the ground. "Listen up, everyone," Thomas announced, his voice booming with a forced, jovial authority that echoed off the high ceiling of the living room. "I know we had a little scheduling issue with the caterer this morning, and obviously, we are all very concerned about Caroline and her mental health. But today is a holiday. Today is about being together. And as the head of this family, I am absolutely not going to let a minor logistical hiccup ruin our Thanksgiving." The low murmurs in the room slowly died down. 25 pairs of eyes turned to look at my father. He stood tall in the center of the room, puffing out his chest, completely slipping back into his favorite role as the wealthy, magnanimous patriarch saving the day. "I have just decided that we are going to pivot," Thomas continued, flashing a brilliant, completely fake smile toward the two angel investors sitting on the sofa. "I am going to call Wellington's Prime downtown. They are the absolute best luxury steakhouse in the city. I know the general manager personally. I am going to order their premium executive holiday package for the entire house. We are talking dry-aged tomahawk ribeyes, chilled seafood towers, truffle mashed potatoes, and their signature lobster macaroni and cheese. It will be here in less than an hour. And do not worry about a thing, folks. Drinks are entirely on me today. A collective wave of relief washed over the crowded living room. A few of the uncles actually clapped their hands. Aunt Martha uncrossed her arms and offered a tight, approving nod. The tension that had been suffocating the house just moments ago instantly evaporated, replaced by the exciting prospect of a highly expensive gourmet feast. I sat on my sunbed in St. Lucia watching the entire performance through the high-definition security feed. It was a masterful display of pure, unadulterated delusion. He was promising them the moon and the stars, completely convinced that he still possessed the financial gravity to pull it off. Thomas pulled his latest model smartphone from his pocket. To ensure that everyone in the room, especially the million-dollar investors, understood exactly how important and wealthy he was, he did not hold the phone to his ear. He tapped the screen and put the call on speakerphone, holding the device proudly in front of his chest. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Wellington's Prime. This is Marcus, the general manager. How can I help you on this beautiful Thanksgiving? Marcus, my friend? It is Thomas, my father practically shouted, projecting his voice so it carried into the formal dining room. Listen, I have a bit of an emergency at my estate. My private caterer fell through at the last minute. I need you to put together an executive holiday spread for 25 people. Best cuts of meat, all the premium sides, and throw in 4 bottles of your vintage reserve Cabernet. Rush delivery to the suburbs. What is the total damage going to be? There was a brief pause on the other end as the manager tapped a keyboard. Well, sir, for a rush delivery of that magnitude on a major holiday, including the vintage wine and the gratuity for the emergency driver, you are looking at exactly $3,540. Not a problem at all, Thomas replied smoothly, not even blinking at the exorbitant price tag. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his thick leather designer wallet. He flipped it open and slid out a sleek, heavy metal platinum credit card. The light from the chandelier caught the metallic edge as he held it up. He read the 16-digit number loudly, clearly, and with absolute supreme confidence. He recited the expiration date and the security code on the back. I leaned closer to my phone screen. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for since midnight. Perfect, Thomas. I am running the card right now, the manager said through the speakerphone. The living room was quiet, filled with the comfortable, expectant silence of wealthy people waiting for a transaction to clear. Jamal was smiling smugly at his investors. Susan was already walking toward the kitchen to find the crystal wine glasses. Stephanie was looking at her reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting her hair. Then the manager's voice came back through the speaker. The crisp, professional tone had shifted into something slightly awkward and deeply apologetic. I am so sorry, Thomas, but it looks like this card has been declined. The word echoed through the living room. Declined. It hung in the air like a foul smell. Susan stopped dead in her tracks. Jamal's smug smile instantly vanished. Aunt Martha raised a single, heavily drawn eyebrow. Thomas let out a loud, booming laugh, though it sounded incredibly hollow and forced. Oh, you know how these premium banks are, Marcus. He chuckled, looking around the room to make sure everyone saw how unbothered he was. The fraud department must have flagged the sudden large charge. They are always overly protective of my accounts. Hold on 1 second, let me give you a different one. His hands were moving a little faster now. He shoved the heavy platinum card back into its slot and aggressively pulled out a shiny gold card. He read the second set of numbers into the phone, his voice slightly louder, slightly tighter than before. Running it now, sir, the manager said. 10 seconds passed. It felt like 10 hours. The silence in the living room was no longer comfortable. It was heavy, sharp, and intensely awkward. Guests were staring at their shoes. The 2 angel investors exchanged a very slow, very deliberate look. Sir, the manager said softly, I am afraid this one is also coming back as declined. The terminal is giving me a message saying the account has been frozen. The blood instantly drained from my father's face. The ruddy, confident flush of the patriarch vanished, leaving him looking pale old and suddenly terrified. He stared down at his leather wallet as if it had just bitten him. "That is impossible," Thomas stammered, his voice losing all of its previous boom. "There is a $50,000 limit on that card. Run it again. You must have typed the numbers wrong." "I assure you, sir, I typed them correctly," the manager replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "The bank has locked the account. Do you have a third form of payment?" Thomas's hands were actually shaking now. I watched through the high-definition lens as a bead of sweat formed on his forehead and slowly rolled down his temple. He fumbled with the leather slots, finally yanking out a standard everyday credit card. He practically yelled the numbers into the phone, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The entire room watched a grown man publicly unravel. My father, the man who demanded I wake up at dawn to cook his meals, the man who threatened to disown me an hour ago, was currently begging a piece of plastic to save his life. "I am sorry, Thomas," the manager said, his voice now completely devoid of warmth. "That card is also declining. Error code indicates a closed account. I cannot process this order without a valid payment method. Shall I cancel the ticket?" "Yes," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "Yes, cancel it." He tapped the red button on the screen. The call ended. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of total, suffocating quiet that only happens when a massive lie is finally exposed to the harsh light of day. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody dared to take a sip of water. Through the security camera, I watched my father slowly lower his phone. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. He looked over at Susan, who had covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sheer panic. He looked at Jamal, who was staring at him with a mixture of horror and disgust. What they did not understand, what none of those judgmental relatives in the living room understood, was the absolute truth about Thomas's finances. My father had not had a dime of his own credit in over 5 years. Every single one of those cards, the platinum, the gold, the standard, were secondary cards issued under my name. I was the primary guarantor. My corporate salary was the only thing propping up their luxury lifestyle. My flawless credit score was the only reason those banks had approved the accounts in the first place. And at exactly 12:01 this morning, while they were all sleeping soundly in their expensive beds, I had logged into the banking portal and permanently removed my name as the guarantor on every single account. The bank's automated systems immediately recognized that the secondary cardholders had absolutely no verifiable income and terrible credit histories. The algorithms did exactly what they were programmed to do. They froze the credit lines, locked the accounts, and shut down the money supply instantly. Thomas was not experiencing a fraud alert. He was experiencing reality. "Well," Aunt Martha finally said, her voice cutting through the dead silence like a razor blade, "it seems your backup plan is just as reliable as your caterer, Susan." Susan let out a small, pathetic sob, unable to formulate a single lie to cover up this level of humiliation. The two angel investors did not say a word. The taller one simply stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and picked up his leather briefcase. The other investor followed suit. They did not look angry. They just looked incredibly bored and entirely finished with the amateur hour they had walked into. They walked past Thomas without making eye contact, headed straight for the front foyer, and let themselves out the heavy oak door. The loud click of the latch closing behind them echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. Jamal watched his $1 million seed funding walk out the door. He turned to Thomas, his face contorted with absolute fury. "Are you kidding me?" Jamal yelled, no longer caring about keeping up appearances for the relatives. "You are broke. You invited my investors to a house with no food, and your credit cards are declining. You ruined my life." I sat back on my sunbed, taking a long, satisfying sip of my mimosa. The first domino had officially fallen, and it had taken down their pride, their social standing, and Jamal's fake business in one swift strike. But the show was far from over. Thomas was about to realize that a declined credit card was the least of his problems today. My phone resting on the teak table suddenly began to vibrate violently. It was Thomas calling me directly. The ultimate confrontation was finally here. I watched my phone vibrate against the teak table. The screen flashed with my father's name. Thomas was calling me directly, undoubtedly ready to scream demand answers and order me to fix his financial humiliation. I did not answer. I simply reached out and tapped the red decline button, sending him straight to voicemail. The ultimate confrontation was indeed coming, but I was going to make him wait for it. I turned my eyes back to the live security camera feed. The scene unfolding in the living room was far too spectacular to miss. Thomas was still standing perfectly still, staring down at his useless leather wallet like it was an alien object. The deafening silence in the house was unbearable. That was when Jamal decided to make his move. He saw an opportunity not just to save the holiday, but to look like an absolute titan of industry in front of his two wealthy New York angel investors. He wanted to play the hero, entirely convinced that his own finances were perfectly secure. Jamal smoothed the lapels of his tailored designer jacket and stepped forward, projecting an aura of supreme, unbothered confidence. "Do not worry about this, Thomas." Jamal announced, his voice loud and incredibly boastful. He pulled out his own sleek, minimalist wallet. "Bank errors happen to the best of us. I have got this completely handled. My company will cover the holiday dinner today. Consider it a business expense." Susan let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, clasping her hands together. "Oh, Jamal, thank you. You are a lifesaver." Jamal offered a magnanimous nod. He pulled out his smartphone, tapped the screen, and dialed the luxury steakhouse back. Just like Thomas, he put the call on speakerphone, ensuring that his investors could hear exactly how easily he threw around thousands of dollars. The phone rang, and the same general manager answered. His tone was distinctly less patient than before. "Wellington's Prime," the manager said sharply. "Yes, hello," Jamal said, using his deepest, most authoritative voice. "This is Jamal. We were just speaking with my father-in-law, Thomas. We experienced a minor technical glitch with his personal banking. I would like to reinstate that executive holiday order for 25 people. I will be putting it on my corporate card." "Very well, sir," the manager replied, typing rapidly on his keyboard. "Go ahead with the card number." Jamal pulled a sleek, heavy metal business credit card from his wallet. It was a card he loved to flash at expensive bars, tied to the limited liability company he had registered for his imaginary fitness application. He read the 16 digits with practiced ease, followed by the expiration date and security code. He then looked over at his investors, offering them a confident, reassuring wink. I sat on my terrace in the Caribbean, watching the screen with intense anticipation. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Jamal's business card was nothing more than a low-limit secured credit line. He had already maxed it out weeks ago, buying the very designer topcoat he was wearing, trying to look successful for these exact investors. The living room waited in breathless silence. The digital seconds ticked by. "Sir," the manager finally said, his voice flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "That corporate card has been declined. Insufficient funds." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Aunt Martha actually let out a sharp, audible gasp. The confident smirk instantly vanished from Jamal's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He stared at his phone as if it had just insulted him. "That is impossible." Jamal stammered, his voice losing all its smooth bravado. "There must be a mistake. Run it again. My startup has aggressive fraud protection protocols. They probably flagged the large catering charge." "I ran it twice, sir," the manager replied coldly. "It is declining for insufficient funds. Do you have an alternative method of payment, or should I cancel this order permanently?" "We are incredibly busy today." Jamal began to sweat. I could see the dark patches forming under the arms of his expensive shirt. He was panicking. He quickly shoved the useless business card back into his wallet and pulled out a standard blue debit card. This was his personal card. More specifically, it was the debit card tied to the joint checking account he shared with my sister Stephanie. "Hold on," Do not cancel the order. Jamal practically begged, completely dropping his wealthy businessman persona. I am going to use my personal account. It is a direct debit. There are thousands of dollars in there. Take this number down. He read the numbers off the blue card. He was breathing heavily now, his eyes darting nervously toward his two investors. The men in the tailored suits were no longer looking around the room. They were staring directly at Jamal, their expressions hardened into masks of deep professional skepticism. I watched the screen, a slow smile spreading across my face. Jamal was absolutely certain that the joint account was flush with cash. He knew he had just deposited a small check, and he knew that I had transferred $4,000 into that account just 2 days ago to cover their car insurance. What he did not know was that I had completely drained that account at midnight. I had moved every single penny of my money back into my private savings and formally closed the joint account permanently. He was trying to draw water from a well that I had already cemented shut. I am sorry, the manager said, and he did not sound sorry at all. This transaction is also denied. The system is telling me that this account does not exist. The account has been closed. I am terminating this order. Have a good day. The call abruptly disconnected. A harsh, rhythmic dial tone filled the silent living room before Jamal frantically hit the end button. The silence that followed was completely paralyzing. It was a thick, heavy blanket of absolute social ruin. Nobody moved. The country club board members stared at the floor. Thomas looked physically ill. Susan was gripping the edge of the sofa, her face pale as a ghost. Jamal stood in the center of the room holding his useless debit card, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. He looked over at his investors, attempting to formulate an excuse, a lie, anything to salvage the wreckage of his presentation. But the investors had seen enough. They were highly successful, pragmatic businessmen. They did not care about family drama, and they certainly did not invest in men who could not even afford to buy lunch. The taller investor, a man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes, stood up from the plush velvet sofa. He casually reached over and buttoned his charcoal suit jacket. His partner immediately followed his lead, picking up his leather briefcase from the floor. They moved with a quiet, deliberate efficiency that signaled the absolute end of the meeting. Jamal took a desperate step forward, holding his hands up. "Gentlemen, please wait," Jamal pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. "This is just a massive misunderstanding with the bank. My sister-in-law handles all of our accounting, and she clearly made an administrative error before she left. Just let me show you the wireframes for the application. The user interface is revolutionary." The tall investor stopped walking. He looked Jamal slowly up and down, taking in the sweating forehead, the desperate eyes, and the sheer pathetic nature of the display. Jamal, the investor, said, his voice calm, clear, and utterly devastating. "If you cannot manage a simple dinner order, I am absolutely not trusting you with $1 million of seed funding. Happy holidays." He did not wait for a response. The two investors turned their backs on my family and walked purposefully out of the living room. They crossed the foyer, opened the heavy oak front door, and stepped out into the freezing wind. The door slammed shut behind them with a heavy final thud. They were gone. The $1 million dream was completely dead. Jamal stood frozen for a few seconds, staring at the closed front door, as if he expected them to walk back inside and announce it was all a joke. When reality finally set in, the shock completely morphed into a blinding, explosive rage. He spun around, his eyes locking onto his wife. Stephanie was standing near the hallway mirror, shrinking back against the wall. She looked terrified. "What did you do?" Jamal roared, his voice echoing violently through the high ceilings of the house. He stormed toward her, waving the blue debit card directly in her face. "What the hell did you do, Stephanie? There was over $4,000 in that account yesterday. I checked it myself. Why did the bank say the account is closed? Where is my money?" Stephanie burst into tears, her perfect holiday aesthetic completely ruined by her sobbing. "I do not know," she shrieked, throwing her hands over her face. "I did not touch it. Caroline must have done something." "Do not blame Caroline for this," Jamal screamed, completely losing control in front of the 25 relatives who were now watching a live, horrifying reality show. Caroline transferred the insurance money in. You are the one who is always spending it. Where is the money, Stephanie? I watched my sister completely unravel. She pulled out her own phone with trembling hands, desperately trying to log into the mobile banking application to prove her innocence. But as she stared at her glowing screen, her face contorted in absolute horror. She was not just looking at a zero balance in the joint account. She was looking at the notification that I had severed my financial ties to her, which meant she was now entirely responsible for the secret high-interest credit card she had maxed out. There is nothing there, Stephanie sobbed, sliding down the wall until she hit the floor. It is all gone. Everything is gone. The facade was completely shattered. The grand illusion of the perfect, wealthy, affluent family had burned to the ground in less than 10 minutes. They had no caterer. They had no money. They had no investors. They were just a group of broke, terrified people standing in a freezing house, being judged by relatives who were currently putting on their winter coats to leave. I watched the absolute chaos unfold from my sunbed, taking a slow, deeply satisfying bite of a tropical fruit skewer. The financial guillotine had dropped perfectly. It was finally time to answer my father's phone call and deliver the killing blow. The smartphone resting on the smooth teak wood of my terrace table began to vibrate violently, buzzing against the hard surface with an angry, relentless rhythm. I glanced down at the bright screen. The caller identification flashed with my father's name in bold, demanding letters. Thomas had already left exactly 4 frantic voicemails in the last 10 minutes, but now he was calling back with a rapid persistence that signaled absolute total desperation. I picked up the device, swiped the green icon to accept the call, and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say a single word. I simply let the line remain open, allowing the heavy silence to stretch, waiting patiently for him to make the first move. Caroline. His voice roared through the small speaker so incredibly loud and sharp that I actually had to pull the phone a few inches away from my head. Through the live security camera feed resting on my lap, I could see exactly what was happening inside the freezing Chicago house. Thomas was standing directly in the center of the living room, clutching his phone out in front of his chest. He had placed me on speakerphone at maximum volume. He wanted an audience. He wanted all 25 of our extended relatives, including the highly judgmental country club board members, to hear him completely dismantle my rebellion and force me back into total submission. He was banking heavily on the idea that I would be far too embarrassed to cause a scene in front of the entire extended family. He had severely miscalculated my capacity for caring about their opinions. Caroline, are you there? Answer me right now, Thomas bellowed. His face flushed a dangerous, terrifying shade of crimson. I am here, Thomas, I replied deliberately, dropping the title of Dad. My voice was smooth, calm, and entirely unbothered. The contrast between my tropical serenity and his freezing, panic-stricken anger was absolute. What the hell did you do to the banking accounts? He demanded, pointing a shaking finger at his own phone as if I could somehow see him through the screen. I just tried to order an emergency catering package from Wellington's Prime to save this holiday, and every single one of my platinum cards was declined. The bank manager said the accounts are completely locked. Unlock them immediately. You are completely ruining our family name in front of our guests. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my mimosa. The cold, crisp citrus washed down my throat. I swallowed, savoring the incredibly sweet taste of total freedom before I finally spoke. I did not lock the accounts, Thomas, I said, making sure my enunciation was crystal clear so that the microphone would pick up every single syllable and broadcast it to the dead silent living room. The bank locked them. And they are absolutely never going to unlock them again. What are you talking about? Thomas snapped, his voice wavering slightly as the panic began to pierce through his aggressive facade. He looked nervously around the room, desperately trying to maintain his mask of supreme authority for Aunt Martha and the cousins who were currently watching him with wide, completely shocked eyes. Stop playing these ridiculous administrative games. You are the one who manages the family trust. Call the fraud department right now and authorize the transaction for the steakhouse. There is no family trust, Thomas, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air of the living room like a perfectly sharpened blade. That single devastating sentence sent a visible shockwave through the crowded room. I watched my mother Susan stagger backward and grip the heavy wooden back of a velvet armchair, her knuckles turning completely white. There never was a family trust. I continued, my tone steady and completely devoid of any sympathy. There was only my paycheck. Every single platinum credit card, every gold rewards card, and every standard account you just tried to use was entirely funded by my corporate salary. I was the primary guarantor on all of those accounts. My flawless credit score and my income were the only reasons the bank approved you for those astronomical spending limits. And last night, at exactly midnight, I formally removed my name and my financial profile from every single one of your accounts. A collective, highly audible gasp echoed through the living room. It was picked up by the speakerphone and transmitted directly into my ear. Through the security camera, I watched Aunt Martha physically recoil, her hand flying up to clutch the collar of her expensive dress. The wealthy country club board members exchanged horrified, incredibly uncomfortable looks. The grand, carefully curated illusion of Thomas as a self-made millionaire patriarch shattered into a million irreversible pieces right in front of their eyes. "You cannot do that," Thomas yelled, his voice cracking violently. The panic was no longer hiding beneath the surface. It had completely taken over his entire body. "Those are joint family resources. You have absolutely no right to cut off our financial access without warning." "I have every right in the world," I replied calmly. "Because it was never our money. It was my money. You have not had a steady job or a verifiable income in over 5 years. You spent your days playing golf at an expensive country club and buying tailored suits to impress people you actively despise." Susan spent her days at luxury day spas and boutique shopping centers, buying things to project an image of wealth she did not possess. Stephanie and Jamal used my joint checking account as their personal slush fund to pretend they were successful entrepreneurs. All of you built a beautiful, lavish, completely fake empire entirely on my back. "Caroline, please stop," Susan pleaded, her voice trembling as she leaned heavily toward Thomas's phone. She was crying now, genuine tears of absolute social terror ruining her perfect makeup. "Please do not talk like this in front of the guests. We can discuss this privately. Just turn the cards back on for today so we can feed our family. Please. We are begging you." "You did not want to discuss anything privately last night," I reminded her, the memory of her cold, dismissive face flashing vividly in my mind. "Last night, when Jamal demanded I cook a custom imported vegan menu after I had just worked a grueling 60-hour week, you stood right there in the kitchen and told me that I was useless. You told me that I lived under your roof, and if I could not contribute to the household, I needed to find somewhere else to live." I paused, letting those heavy words sink into the minds of every single relative sitting in that room. I wanted them to hear exactly how this pristine upper-class family treated the woman secretly funding their entire survival. "So I took your excellent advice, Susan," I said softly. "I decided to stop contributing to your household entirely. You wanted me to find somewhere else to live, so I packed my bags in the middle of the night and flew to a 5-star resort in the Caribbean. I am currently sitting on a private teak terrace overlooking the ocean, drinking a mimosa that I bought with the exact $15,000 Jamal demanded I invest in his ridiculous fitness application yesterday morning." I watched Jamal through the camera feed. He had completely stopped yelling at his wife. He was staring blindly at the speakerphone, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He finally realized that his imaginary seed money was gone forever, completely spent on a luxury tropical vacation meant to celebrate his total financial ruin. "You are a monster," Thomas whispered, his voice completely stripped of its usual booming power. He sounded small, weak, and entirely defeated. You are deliberately trying to destroy us. I am not destroying anything, I corrected him, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. I simply stopped paying your bills. The only thing destroying you right now is the harsh reality of your own financial incompetence. You wanted to host 25 people for a gourmet holiday dinner. You wanted to impress wealthy angel investors. You wanted to act like the powerful head of a successful dynasty. Well, congratulations, Thomas. Now you finally have the chance to do it with your own money. We do not have any money, Stephanie suddenly shrieked from the hallway, her voice filled with a desperate, terrifying hysteria. She crawled toward the living room, dark mascara running down her pale cheeks. She completely closed the checking account. The bank is going to come after me for my secret credit card debt. Dad, what are we going to do? The relatives began to stand up. Aunt Martha was the first one to make a definitive move toward the coat closet in the front foyer. The country club board members followed immediately behind her, keeping their heads down. Nobody wanted to be inside that house for another second. They had come for a free, luxurious holiday meal and a display of upper-class social dominance. Instead, they had walked into a humiliating, deeply uncomfortable exposure of massive financial fraud and horrific familial abuse. They were fleeing the scene of a rapidly sinking ship. "Look at what you have done!" Thomas screamed into the phone, watching his precious high society guests practically sprint for the front door. "They are all leaving. You have made us a complete laughingstock." "No, Thomas," I said smoothly, thoroughly enjoying the absolute finality of my words. "You made yourselves a laughingstock the exact moment you believed you could treat the foundation of your entire life like garbage and expect it never to crumble. I am not your maid. I am not your bank, and I am absolutely no longer your problem. Good luck figuring out how to buy groceries tomorrow." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button, instantly cutting off his frantic screaming. The line went completely dead. I set the phone face down on the table, leaned back against my plush sunbed, and closed my eyes against the bright Caribbean sun. The heavy chains were finally broken. The truth was out, the money was gone, and the worst was yet to come for the people who had taken me for granted. My phone barely rested on the teak table for 3 seconds before the screen violently lit up again. Thomas was calling back. A man who had spent his entire life commanding absolute obedience from his family simply could not mentally process the reality of his designated servant hanging up on him. His fragile, towering ego demanded that he get the last word. He needed to reassert his dominance, especially with the remnants of his country club audience still hovering in the front hallway. I picked up the device, tapped the green button to accept the call, and put the phone back on speaker mode. I set it down on the table, keeping my eyes locked on the live security camera feed. "Do not you ever hang up on me!" Thomas shrieked through the speaker, his voice completely raw and cracking with desperate rage. "Who do you think you are talking to? You are going to log into your computer right now. You are going to fix this banking error, and you are going to apologize to your mother." "I am not finished, Thomas," I said, my voice incredibly smooth, completely ignoring his frantic demands. My calm tone sliced through his hysteria like a razor. "And since Jamal is standing right there wondering exactly where his money went, let me clear that up for him." On the camera feed, Jamal snapped his head toward the phone in Thomas's hand. He stopped his panicked pacing and stepped closer, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Stephanie, who was still sitting on the floor by the hallway mirror, suddenly went completely rigid. She looked up, her eyes wide with sheer terror, realizing exactly what I was about to do. "Jamal," I said, making sure my enunciation was perfectly clear so everyone in the room could hear me, "the reason your debit card declined is not because of a bank error. It is because your lovely wife has been secretly siphoning your joint checking account for the past 2 years. Stephanie scrambled to her feet, waving her hands frantically. "No, do not listen to her," she screamed, her voice completely hysterical. "She is lying, Jamal. She is just trying to tear us apart." I did not raise my voice to talk over her. I just continued with absolute surgical precision. She has $80,000 in secret credit card debt. Jamal, 80,000. She opened a premium card entirely in her own name to buy those designer coats, those luxury handbags, and those weekend spa trips with her friends. She did it just to pretend she was married to a successful entrepreneur. Through the crisp, high-definition feed, I watched Jamal slowly turn his head to look at his wife. The remaining relatives in the foyer completely froze their coats halfway on, absolutely captivated by the horrific car crash of a marriage imploding right in front of them. You had absolutely no income flowing into that account. I continued thoroughly enjoying the absolute destruction of the golden child's perfect image. So Stephanie was draining whatever small amounts of cash you managed to scrape together just to make her minimum monthly payments. When that was not enough, she came crying to me. I was the one quietly transferring my own money into your joint account every single month just to keep the debt collectors from calling the house and ruining your fake aesthetic. Last night, I decided my charity was officially over. I emptied the account and closed it. You are broke, Jamal, and your wife is drowning in high-interest debt. Jamal dropped his useless business cards onto the floor. He looked at Stephanie, his chest heaving. $80,000, he whispered the microphone, picking up the sheer devastation in his voice. You maxed out $80,000 while I was trying to build a company. Stephanie burst into loud, ugly sobs, burying her face in her hands. I had to, Jamal, she wailed. Everyone at the club thought we were poor. I had to keep up appearances. I watched the golden pedestal that my parents had placed Stephanie on for 32 years completely disintegrate into dust. The perfect daughter was a fraud, and her successful husband was a complete failure. Thomas tried to regain control of the room. Enough, he shouted into the phone, his face purple. Caroline, I do not care about Stephanie's shopping habits right now. We are talking about the holiday dinner. We are talking about the disrespect you are showing your mother and me. That brings me to my final point, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dead calm that immediately commanded the silence of the room. I want to address Susan. My mother, who had been quietly weeping near the kitchen archway, slowly lifted her head. She looked completely shattered, her perfect silk dress wrinkling as she gripped the wall for physical support. Last night, I said, taking my time with every single word. When you were standing in the kitchen, sipping your expensive red wine, while I was reading a 3-page list of chores, you told me that if I could not contribute to your household, I needed to find somewhere else to live. Susan let out a small, pathetic whimper. Under your roof, you said. That was a very bold statement, Susan, especially considering you do not actually own a roof. The living room fell so completely silent that I could hear the faint ambient hum of the refrigerator all the way from the kitchen. Thomas froze. The aggressive, domineering posture he had maintained for his entire life completely vanished. He suddenly looked like a very old, very terrified man. What you conveniently hid from Aunt Martha and the rest of the family sitting in that room, I said, making sure the relatives heard every single syllable, is that the bank foreclosed on this beautiful house 3 years ago. You took out a massive, reckless second mortgage to fund Jamal's first failed business venture, and you defaulted on every single payment. You were 30 days away from being evicted by the county sheriff. Aunt Martha let out a loud, genuine gasp. She looked at Susan with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. You lied to us, Martha whispered sharply. You told us the house was fully paid off. I bought this property directly from the bank in a cash auction. I continued speaking directly over the family murmurs. I used an anonymous limited liability company so your precious country club neighbors would not find out about your total financial collapse. I have been paying the massive mortgage. I have been paying the property taxes. I have been paying the premium homeowner's insurance. I am your landlord. You have been living rent-free in my house, treating me like an unpaid servant and sleeping in the master guest suite while forcing me to live in a freezing, unheated attic. Thomas collapsed onto the velvet sofa as if his legs had suddenly been cut out from underneath him. He buried his face in his hands, completely unable to look at the relatives who were now staring at him with absolute contempt. But since I am so incredibly ungrateful, I said, my voice echoing through the destroyed living room, and since you so kindly advised me to find another place to live, I took your advice to heart. I decided I no longer wanted to carry the burden of this massive property. Susan let out a loud, terrifying scream, finally realizing exactly what was coming. No, Caroline, please. This is my home. Not anymore, I replied smoothly. I sold the property to a commercial real estate developer on Tuesday morning. The legal paperwork is completely finalized. The escrow funds have already cleared into my private account. The new owners are planning to demolish the house to build luxury townhomes. The utter devastation on the security camera feed was almost artistic in its perfection. The grand illusion was dead. The money was gone. The golden child was exposed. And the massive, beautiful suburban fortress they had used to judge everyone else was officially stripped away from them. The developer will be sending a formal representative to the property on Monday morning, I stated, delivering the absolute final blow. By law, you have exactly 30 days to vacate my property before the local authorities arrive to physically remove you and your belongings. I suggest you start packing your bags instead of worrying about the country club board members. You are going to need a lot of boxes. Caroline, I am begging you. Thomas sobbed into the phone, completely abandoning all his pride. He was crying openly, his shoulders shaking. We have nowhere to go. We have no money. Please do not do this to your family. If you wanted family. Thomas, you should have loved your daughter instead of exploiting your landlord, I said softly. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving dinner. Enjoy the onion. I pulled the phone away from my ear and firmly pressed the red button to end the call. I did not wait for another scream or another desperate plea. I completely powered down the device, sliding it into the pocket of my linen sundress. The screen went permanently black. I sat back on my sunbed, looking out at the vast, glittering expanse of the Caribbean Sea. The warm tropical sun beat down on my skin, and the gentle sound of the ocean waves completely replaced the frantic, toxic noise of my past. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the sweet, salt-tinged air, and smiled. The eviction notice had been delivered, and for the first time in 35 years, my life belonged entirely to me. I looked down at the glowing screen of my smartphone one last time. The live high-definition video feed from the living room security camera was broadcasting the absolute irreversible destruction of my family's grand illusion. The pandemonium was swift and entirely ruthless. Aunt Martha practically shoved her way into the front foyer coat closet. She grabbed her heavy fur coat, not even bothering to put her arms through the sleeves, simply draping it over her shoulders so she could escape the humiliating environment faster. She looked at Susan one last time, shook her head in a display of absolute disgust, and walked out the front door without saying a single word of goodbye. The rest of the extended relatives and country club board members followed her lead like water draining rapidly from a shattered glass. Uncles, cousins, and lifelong family friends grabbed their scarves and gloves, scrambling out of the house. They muttered nervously to one another, entirely eager to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the toxic, fraudulent wasteland my parents had created. Within 3 minutes, the massive parade of judgmental guests had completely vanished, leaving the heavy oak front door wide open to the freezing winter wind. Jamal did not stay to comfort his weeping wife. I watched him sprint frantically up the grand hardwood staircase, his heavy footsteps echoing through the empty house. Less than 5 minutes later, he came storming back down his face, a mask of furious determination, carrying a bulging designer leather duffel bag over his shoulder. Stephanie scrambled up from the floor, her makeup ruined by tears, and tried to grab his arm. She was sobbing hysterically, begging him to stay, promising him that they could somehow figure out the massive mountain of high-interest debt she had hidden from him. Jamal aggressively yanked his arm away, almost knocking her off balance. He looked at the golden child with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He yelled that she had completely ruined his life, turned on his heel, and marched straight out into the cold. He slammed the front door shut with such violent force that the camera lens actually vibrated. The camera feed settled on the wide view of the house. It was completely empty of guests. Thomas and Susan were left standing alone in the massive, beautifully decorated living room they no longer owned. The silence in the house was absolute and deafening. Through the kitchen archway, the camera captured the final pathetic image of their ruined Thanksgiving. The 25-pound frozen turkey was still sitting right in the middle of the expensive granite island, the steel carving knife still sticking straight out of its chest, serving as a permanent, undeniable monument to their complete and utter failure. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of finality wash over me. I pressed my finger against the smart home security application icon on my screen. A small menu popped up. I tapped the button to permanently delete the application. The digital window into my past vanished instantly, closing the door on 35 years of manipulation, financial abuse, and emotional neglect. Then I pressed the power button on the side of my device. I held it down until the screen went completely black. The digital tether was officially severed. I stood up from the plush sunbed on my private terrace. The tropical evening was just beginning to settle over the island of St. Lucia. The sky above the endless ocean was painted in brilliant, breathtaking shades of deep violet, bright pink, and warm gold. I smoothed down my flowing linen sundress, slipped on my sandals, and walked down the illuminated stone pathway toward the beachfront restaurant of the luxury resort. The air smelled of blooming jasmine, sea salt, and roasting garlic. I was seated at a beautiful, intimate table situated right on the edge of the pristine white sand. Tall tiki torches flickered warmly in the evening breeze, casting a soft, golden glow over the crisp white tablecloth. I ordered the chef's special, a magnificent spread featuring a freshly caught butter-roasted lobster tail and a perfectly seared tender filet mignon. I paired the meal with a glass of their most expensive vintage red wine. When the food arrived, it was nothing short of culinary perfection. The flavors were incredibly rich and vibrant, a stark, beautiful contrast to the single boiling onion I had left behind in Chicago. The waiter treated me with absolute respect and genuine kindness, ensuring my glass was never empty. The couple sitting at the table next to me celebrating their anniversary struck up a warm, friendly conversation. They did not ask me for money. They did not demand I scrub their silver or cater to their impossible demands. They simply shared a cheerful toast to the beautiful Caribbean evening. I raised my crystal wine glass, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip. I looked out over the dark, rolling waves of the ocean. For the first time in my entire adult life, I took a deep, full breath, and my chest did not tighten with crushing anxiety. My shoulders dropped, my jaw unclenched. I was entirely, undeniably free. 6 months later, the freezing winter snows of Chicago had long since melted into a bright, promising spring, and my reality had completely transformed. I was thriving in ways I never thought possible. Without the exhausting, constant drain of managing my family's endless financial crises and emotional tantrums, my career skyrocketed. I received a massive promotion at my logistics firm, moving up to the executive level. I used my increased salary and the massive profits from the cash sale of the suburban house to build a life that was entirely my own. I moved into a gorgeous, sprawling high-rise apartment right in the heart of downtown. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking views of the city skyline. My walls were painted a vibrant, calming green, finally replacing the pale, depressing blue my mother had always forced upon me. I surrounded myself with beautiful furniture, quiet, peaceful mornings, and a newly formed circle of friends who actually cared about my well-being and respected my personal boundaries. As for my family, the harsh reality of the real world hit them with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The commercial real estate developer had aggressively enforced the 30-day eviction notice. Without my money to quietly prop up their luxurious lifestyle, they had absolutely nowhere to hide from their own incompetence. The prestigious country club immediately revoked their membership for unpaid dues, completely exiling them from the high society circles they had sacrificed everything to impress. Through the final legal documents processed by my attorney, I learned exactly where they ended up. Stephanie Thomas and Susan were forced to pool whatever meager, pathetic resources they had left just to survive. They ended up renting a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a rundown aging complex on the far outskirts of the city. The golden child was finally forced to step off her pedestal and face the consequences of her vanity. Stephanie had to take a grueling job working long, exhausting shifts at a discount retail store just to make the minimum monthly payments on her massive secret credit card debt. Jamal had officially filed for divorce weeks after the Thanksgiving disaster, leaving her entirely alone to clean up the financial wreckage of her fake aesthetic. Thomas, the arrogant patriarch who used to boast loudly about angel investors and luxury steakhouses, was forced to swallow his towering pride. He took a low-level minimum-wage administrative job at a local car dealership just to keep the lights on in their tiny apartment. Susan had to learn how to clip coupons, ride the public bus, and buy generic groceries, completely stripped of her expensive silk dresses, her heavy pearl necklaces, and her insufferable high-society arrogance. I never reached out to them. I never answered the few desperate emails they initially tried to send to my corporate address. I let them lie in the exact uncomfortable bed they had spent decades making. They had traded a devoted, hard-working daughter for a few years of fake luxury, and in the end, they were left with absolutely nothing. Sometimes, the only way to win a rigged game is to flip the board and walk away. If they only love what you can provide, they do not love you at all. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family table? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and remember, your peace is worth more than their approval.